Hey, guys, it's time to dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before he was Alexander the Great, he was Alexander. Eat your porridge. Long before empire building, world conquest, and being mourned by three continents, young Alexander of Macedon started his days like every other noble boy, with a breakfast that was aggressively wholesome and suspiciously hard to chew. Picture a chilly Macedonian morning. The sun's not even up yet, and neither is Aristotle, but the kitchen is alive with the sounds of boiling barley and people pretending it tastes better today. Breakfast for young Alexander likely consisted of boiled barley gruel, which is just a polite way of saying hot, slightly salty mush. Occasionally, it might have been elevated with a splash of goat's milk, or if it was a holiday, a dried fig that looked like it had been through something traumatic. Next to this steaming bowl of mild despair, there would have been bread, probably made of emmer or barley flour, rough in texture and morally opposed to fluffiness. It was the kind of bread that stared back, that held grudges, that doubled as a blunt object in times of political tension. Olives would make an appearance too, because nothing says childhood breakfast like bitter, oily fruit soaked in brine. And if you were lucky, and by lucky I mean born into a royal bloodline with at least one surviving parent, you might get a wedge of goat cheese aged to the point of self-defense and capable of clearing your sinuses from across the room. To wash it all down, wine. Yes, even for a kid. But don't get excited. It was heavily diluted, practically purple water. Macedonians believed drinking pure wine was for barbarians and poets with poor judgment. It sounds humble, and it was. But it wasn't because the Macedonian court lacked resources. No, Alexander's father, Philip II, deliberately raised his son in a culture of restraint. No luxury, no softness. Just calories, protein, and the psychological conditioning of a man who would one day eat field rations in Persia without blinking. So no golden pancakes, no royal eggs Benedict. Just mush, olives, and bread so dense it could hold up a collapsing column. Breakfast, the first conquest of the day. Imagine sitting down to eat your lunch, and across from you is Aristotle, philosopher, scientist, and full-time buzzkill when it came to overindulgence. You just want to enjoy your barley bread and maybe a fig, and he's over there giving a TED talk on moderation between bites of lentil stew. Alexander, as a teenager, wasn't just learning how to swing a sword. He was trained in ethics, logic, rhetoric, and probably which foods made you too lazy to conquer Asia. Aristotle, being a disciple of Plato and a fan of balance in all things, took personal responsibility for making sure Alexander's body and mind were equally fed, though probably not equally thrilled. Meals were opportunities for character development. If you reached for a second chunk of cheese, Aristotle was likely to raise an eyebrow and casually mention how gluttony dulls the soul and thickens the wits. Fun times. But this wasn't just some uptight food shaming. Aristotle believed food played a central role in shaping leaders. Too little, and you were weak; too much, and you were decadent. Somewhere in between, you got an empire and a tight core. It's likely Alexander learned the difference between food for fuel and food for vanity during these lessons. Simple legumes like lentils were considered good for the soul, which is impressive considering they taste like disappointment and less aggressively seasoned. Meanwhile, anything too sweet, spicy, or luxurious was to be treated with suspicion, as if it might corrupt your morals and have you lounging in velvet by sunset. There's even some irony in how food became an educational tool. While most kids were learning the alphabet by scratching letters into wax tablets, Alexander was probably being quizzed on what Hippocrates thought about wine ratios and whether figs stimulated impure thoughts. This dietary philosophy stuck with him, even when Persian cuisine was throwing its best at him. Lamb cooked in pomegranate glaze, rice so fragrant it should have been illegal. Alexander often stuck to the basics. Bread, meat, water, maybe a few olives if things were wild. So no, lunch with Aristotle wasn't fun, but it was formative. Alexander didn't just learn how to conquer cities. He learned how to say no to seconds, and that in ancient Macedon with leadership. If you've ever packed a lunch with love, hope, and exactly one slice of stale bread, congratulations. You may already qualify as a Macedonian field cook. The average midday meal in ancient Macedon wasn't about flavor. It was about not fainting in the sun while shouting military slogans. Alexander's daily lunch, especially before his campaigns, would have been modest to the point of austerity. We're talking about a rough chunk of barley or emma bread. Hardened to the consistency of ceramic tile, this was the kind of bread you had to earn the right to chew, preferably with a dagger and a prayer. Accompanying this crunchy cornerstone of the meal were a few local treasures. Goat cheese that traveled well but smelled like it wanted to fight you, and onions, which were practically a food group in Macedon. Onions were thought to promote strength and endurance, and evidently bad breath diplomacy. You might also get a small pouch of figs or dried dates, depending on the season and whether the supply caravan hadn't been eaten by wolves. These fruits were the ancient world's version of dessert, chewy, sticky, and with a texture somewhere between leather and regret. For protein, there might be salted or dried meat, typically goat or beef, sometimes boar if they just raided someone fancy. It wasn't juicy. It wasn't tender. It was the kind of meat that dared you to choke on it and win. And what did they drink? If they were lucky, diluted wine. If not, lukewarm water from a leather flask which had spent most of the day marinating in sweat and saddle dust. Refreshing, technically. It's worth noting that Alexander ate the same food as his soldiers. He didn't send for exotic spices or request grapes peeled by hand. No, he sat in the dirt, tore off a piece of rock-hard bread, and chewed like a man trying to motivate an empire with his jaw strength alone. So when we talk about the Macedonian lunchbox, don't picture a cute bento set. Picture a burlap pouch of calories that hated you just enough to keep you alive. Functional, brutal, just like the man himself. Dinner with your father is already a tense affair when you're a teenager. Now imagine your father is King Philip II of Macedon, a man who juggled diplomacy, warfare, and at least 7 wives like it was a competitive sport. Welcome to mealtime at the royal table, where the food was warm and the conversations could lead to exile. Philip's dinners were likely grand by Macedonian standards, but still a far cry from Roman-style gluttony. Think roasted meats, stews thick with lentils, boiled grains, and a jug of wine that has seen things. The man was famously fond of his drink. Historical sources politely call him heavy drinking. That ancient biographer speaks for your dad drunk again. Alexander, on the other hand, often abstained or drank sparingly, not because he didn't like wine, but because Philip had a habit of mixing politics with Pinot, and young Alexander was already strategizing around him like a mini-general. Nothing spoils your appetite like watching your dad negotiate a military alliance between bites of charred lamb and the conversation. Intense. You've got military advisors arguing over borders, poets reciting verses between gulps of stew, and philosophers casually insulting each other in ancient Greek. All while Alexander quietly eats his cheese and plots how to eventually outconquer his father, which he absolutely did, by the way. Occasionally, Philip would bring back exotic ingredients or dishes from other parts of the Greek world. Spiced fish, honey pastries, or strange herbs that made your tongue tingle. Alexander tried them. He made polite comments, but he always circled back to the basics. Bread, meat, wine. Solid, predictable, useful for empire building, the emotional side of these dinners. Let's just say therapy wasn't invented yet. Philip was both a role model and a raging migraine in sandals. Their relationship was part love, part gladiator match. At one dinner, Alexander even stormed out after Philip drunkenly insulted him. That's how bad the vibes were. And this was before someone tried to assassinate Philip with a spear. So yes, dinner with Dad was formative. It sharpened Alexander's political instincts, toughened his resolve, and probably gave him a lifelong preference for quiet meals with fewer stabbing risks. Now let's talk about Alexander on the road. Not just any road, but the kind that stretches through scorching deserts, snow-bitten passes, and occasionally over the burning remains of your enemies. What's for lunch on this scenic route? A delightful serving of desperation with a side of tactical nutrition. Field rations in Alexander's army weren't made for flavor. They were made for survival, mobility, and ideally not killing you mid-march. Picture a linen pouch filled with barley bread, onions, and dried meat. Ingredients that were travel-friendly, immortal, and borderline spiteful in texture. The bread is dense, hard, and unflavored. If you could chew through it without breaking a tooth, congratulations, you were fit for service. These loaves doubled as utensil shields, and in extreme cases, emotional support objects. Reheated over a campfire, could almost pass as edible. Oh, you'd sooner bite a rock. Meat, if available, was salted beyond recognition. Goat, lamb, or beef sliced thin, left to dry in the sun, and salted until it became more mineral than muscle. This wasn't jerky. This was ancient dental testing material. It kept well, though. And if you soaked it long enough in water or wine, it might even bend. Onions and garlic were constant companions, not because they were fun, but because they were cheap, pungent, and believed to boost stamina. Nothing says I'm ready for battle like breath so intense it clears a phalanx. For hydration, there was diluted wine. Not enough to get drunk, but just enough to make the water taste less like saddle leather and regret. Straight water was rarely safe, especially when you were 700 miles into Persia and the local streams were busy being cursed. There were exceptions. Occasionally, after a victory, Alexander allowed a feast. Roast animals, flatbreads with herbs, wine that didn't taste like boiled sandals. But those were rare and always followed by another brutal march. It was never luxury for luxury's sake. It was rewarded with a return to reality baked in. So yes, field rations weren't gourmet, but they kept you alive, alert, and just angry enough to take on the next empire. And Alexander, he ate the same thing. Not because he had to, but because he believed no man deserved better food than his army. Picture this. You've been marching for days through blistering heat. Your sandals are basically leather regrets. And your throat feels like it's been personally cursed by the sun god Helios. Suddenly a soldier finds a meager puddle. Not a spring, not a stream, just a muddy, probably frog-adjacent puddle, and scoops the water into his helmet. Now here comes the historical part. That soldier offers it to Alexander, the king of kings, slayer of Persian armies, conqueror of worlds, and he just looks at the water. Thanks, man. And then pours it onto the ground in front of everyone. It's one of the most iconic and dramatically parched moments of Alexander's life. Not because of what he drank, but because of what he did. But let's pause. Why a helmet? Because in the ancient world, cookware was optional, but helmets were standard. It was your drinking cup, your bowl, your head shield, your emergency chamber pot. Multifunctional, efficient, slightly unsanitary. Alexander's gesture wasn't about hydration. It was performance art with morale as the target. If he, the most powerful man alive, wasn't going to drink until everyone had water, then you, the foot soldier with sunburn and trench foot, could hold out too. Was the water safe? Probably not. Ancient armies didn't exactly have Brita filters, but that wasn't the point in one smooth motion. Alexander turned dehydration into team building. It's like a corporate trust fall, but dustier and with more sandals. And the legend stuck. Writers like Arion and Plutarch couldn't get enough of it. Because here was a man who didn't just lead by strategy. He led by stage suffering. He was hungry when they were. He walked when they did, and when the only water available looked like it came from a donkey hoof print. He still refused to drink before his men. It's honestly genius. Anyone can share a feast, but not drink with someone. That's emotional warfare. So the next time you sip bottled water and complain that it's not cold, remember Alexander once looked at a helmet of lukewarm frog soup and said no thanks. Oh wait, and his army loved him for it. Conquering an empire has its perks. One of them, food upgrades. When Alexander marched into Persia, he wasn't just greeted by trembling nobles and abandoned palaces. He was greeted by banquets so rich they made Macedonian bread look like gravel in a napkin. Persian cuisine didn't mess around. These were the people who gave the world rice pilaf, saffron, stewed lamb with pomegranate reduction, and about 47 types of sweet that all sounded vaguely like honey brick. Their royal banquets were architectural gold dishes, crystal pitches, exotic fruits stacked like pyramids, and enough roasted meats to spook the small forest. And then there's Alexander, king of khaki porridge and philosophical restraint, walking into this culinary fever dream. It was like putting a Spartan in a Whole Foods. Did he indulge? Sometimes he wasn't made of stone. Sources say he did try the saffron rice, the date-filled pastries, and the wine was so strong it needed its own map. But overall, he kept his diet surprisingly modest. He still preferred bread, meat, and water over any jeweled stew or gold-dusted fig. This wasn't just personal preference, it was a statement to Alexander. Overindulgence meant softness, and softness in his worldview led to losing empires. So while Persian nobles reclined on silk cushions biting into stuffed quail, Alexander was still chewing on his trusty barley biscuit, likely wishing it had a bit more existential resolve. He did, however, let his men enjoy the spoils. After years of dust and boiled goat, they deserve a night or 12 of gluttony. Roast lamb, grilled fish, honey cakes, all served on dishes so ornate they probably had their own inheritance plan. But Alexander, he stayed cautious. He'd seen what happened to leaders who let luxury dig in too deep. A soft belly made a poor shield on the battlefield. That said, he wasn't completely immune. A few Persian ingredients, like rose water and cinnamon, reportedly made their way into his meals. Flavor, after all, was not treason. So yes, Persia sent a buffet, and Alexander sampled it. But in the end, he still dined like a man with deserts to cross, enemies to chase, and a deep distrust of anything that sparkled on a plate. Alexander never actually sat down to dinner with Darius III, but he definitely sat down to dinner because of him. After chasing the Persian king across Asia, like the world's most determined food delivery guy, Alexander eventually inherited more than just his throne. He inherited his entire dining setup. We're talking about a royal kitchen operation on steroids. Darius didn't travel with a few cooks and a pot. He traveled with hundreds of chefs, bakers, spice handlers, and professional food testers whose job was essentially to eat this in case it kills the king. It was less of a camp and more of a Michelin-starred military convoy. When Darius fled and left the dining tent behind, Alexander entered a world of decadence previously reserved for immortals and people with very fragile egos. Gold-plated dishes, tables groaning under slow roasted lamb, saffron rice, grilled fish wrapped in fig leaves, and sauces that had been aged longer than most Macedonian soldiers. How did Alexander react? Well, like a man raised on onions and skepticism, he sat bolt upright, reportedly ignored the couches and ate quietly while everyone around him reclined and tried not to make eye contact with extremely intense conqueror. No slouching, no lounging, just chewing with purpose and possibly judgment. This wasn't rudeness, it was intentional signaling. Alexander wasn't about to get caught playing Persian prince cosplay. He wanted everyone, especially former Persian nobles, now awkwardly handing him their loyalty to know he was still Macedonian, still disciplined, and still very capable of kicking over the table if things got too soft. But let's not pretend he didn't enjoy the variety. Sources mention that Alexander adopted some Persian dining customs, like multi-course meals and the occasional floral scented wine. He wasn't above appreciating good food, he was just above needing it. So no, he didn't dine with Darius in the traditional sense, but he dined in Darius's seat, with Darius's silverware surrounded by Darius's terrified chefs, which in a way was even more satisfying. After all, revenge is a dish best served on a gold platter with a side of roasted goat and political domination. Alexander the Great was famous for a lot of things: tactical brilliance, unstoppable ambition, world domination before the age of 33. But tonight's menu? Wine. So much wine. Enough wine to make Dionysus say, "Hey, maybe pace yourself." Despite his usual restraint, there were moments, rare, theatrical, and slightly tragic, when Alexander leaned fully into the goblet. The most infamous of these took place in Persia, when the conquering hero, surrounded by luxury and a lot of people who nodded too quickly, hosted a massive, flamingly indulgent banquet. What was served? Likely an overwhelming spread of Persian delicacies. Roasted lamb, rice pilafs, spiced fruits, date syrups, and wine poured like it owed someone money. There were toasts, long ones, emotional ones, possibly ones that involved dramatic recitations of Homer and crying about Achilles. Then came the incident. After many rounds of increasingly blurry diplomacy, Alexander, reportedly sloshed but still regal, decided to burn down the royal palace at Persepolis. Why? Historians still argue. Some say it was symbolic. Others say it was revenge. A few suspect it was a drunk dare egged on by his equally plaster companions. You know how it goes. A little too much fermented grape juice, and suddenly you're torching a world wonder. Alexander woke up with the ancient equivalent of a hangover and a slightly charred empire. It may be the first recorded moment of post-wine regret in military history. This wasn't an isolated case of tipsy leadership. Other stories mention fights breaking out after the bank. Quits, including one tragic evening when Alexander, in a drunken rage, killed his close friend Clytus, the same man who had once saved his life in battle. That particular night ended with vomiting, tears, and a crisis of existential proportions. Just your average Friday in Babylon. The takeaway. For a man so obsessed with control, alcohol was his one blind spot, and the more success he had, the harder it was to keep the wine, and the yes men from overflowing. So yes, Alexander drank, occasionally too much. And when he did, he wasn't a king or a god. He was just a very drunk man with a very bad sense of scale and unfortunately access to torture. Marching into India was not just a geopolitical maneuver. It was a culinary curveball for Alexander and his exhausted flatbread-fed troops. They had crossed scorching deserts, trudged through freezing mountain passes, and now here they were, face to face with spices they couldn't pronounce and animals that looked like siege towers with tusks. Food-wise, India was a revelation. This was a land of lentils, rice, ginger, turmeric, tamarind, and enough chili-adjacent heat to turn a Macedonian soldier's helmet into a steam room. Ancient sources, albeit vague and vaguely dazzled, describe how the army encountered entirely new flavors, curries, fragrant stews, and vegetables that weren't just boiled until emotional. Alexander reportedly welcomed it. Despite his taste for simplicity, he was curious, adaptable, and just self-aware enough to know that you don't insult local cuisine while you're still technically invading. He tried their food. He respected their traditions. He did not, however, learn to cook. That remained strictly someone else's problem. His men, on the other hand, did not adjust as gracefully. Macedonian soldiers were built for meat, bread, and grumpiness. Spiced lentils and strange fruits were met with suspicion, or in some cases, public complaints loud enough to scare the elephants. Rumor has it many soldiers began missing good old barley stew. That is, if you can call barley stew good. Then came the elephants. Not as dinner, mind you. As battlefield opponents, Alexander, always the pragmatist, probably took one look at a war elephant and said, okay, we're not eating that, but we're definitely hiring a few. Still, Indian hospitality came with tables full of richly flavored dishes, goat simmer and spices, fried doughs, date desserts. Even if Alexander stuck to small portions, he couldn't ignore the overwhelming generosity, in fact. Some reports claim he sent food back to his troops as a morale booster, which ancient generals speak for. Here, try this and stop crying. Ultimately, India expanded more than just the empire's borders. It expanded their taste buds, their spice tolerance, and their emergency bathroom planning. And for a man who had once considered a salted onion lunch, this was gruff. You can conquer Persia, march through Egypt, cross into India, and dine with kings. But eventually the lentil always finds you. For Alexander, no matter how far he wandered or how many golden feasts were laid before him, he kept circling back to the culinary equivalent of a shrug. Boiled lentils. Humble, unpretentious, and textured somewhere between mushy gravel and warm skepticism, lentils were his dietary North Star. Now, was this because he loved lentils? Probably not. No child dreams of one day ruling the world while munching on lukewarm legumes. But lentils were practical, nutritious, and most importantly, politically neutral. They didn't scream luxury, didn't stir envy, and didn't cause diplomatic incidents. They were just there, like sandals or your most loyal but boring advisor. In a world of exotic foods and dangerous banquets, lentils were safe. They didn't come from suspicious sources, they didn't require translation, and they certainly didn't lead to palace arson. Sea Wine Chapter 9. For a ruler who slept with a dagger under his pillow, this was ideal cuisine. Historically, lentils had long been a staple in the Greek and Macedonian diet, high in protein, easy to store, and cookable with just a pot, fire, and low expectations. Add a little vinegar or oil, maybe some crushed garlic if you're feeling fancy, and voila, the ancient version of I'm too tired to cook. Some sources suggest that even in Babylon, with access to every spice, roast, and delicacy imaginable, Alexander still requested simple meals. And lentils, of course, made the shortlist. It wasn't a punishment. It was philosophy, a nod to discipline, and maybe a subtle flex. I could eat honeyed quail wrapped in gold leaf, but I choose mushy brown pulses. It's also likely that lentils reminded him of home, of training in the Macedonian hills, of dinners with Aristotle, where the food came with moral lessons, and of military camps where the only thing consistent was the sound of chewing something slightly tragic. So yes, the lentils returned. Not with a fanfare, but with a quiet plop into a wooden bowl. And Alexander, emperor of half the known world, picked up his spoon and ate. Because even greatness needs fiber. When you think of royal snacks, you might imagine grapes peeled by trembling servants, or delicate pastries served on silver trays, while a harpist plays something emotionally complex in the background. But for Alexander the Great, snacking wasn't quite so cinematic. Most of the time, snacks were consumed while riding horseback, overseeing a siege, or casually redrawing the boundaries of the known world. So convenience was key. Snackability was measured not by flavor, but by whether it could survive being dropped in a saddlebag, stepped on by a horse, and still be technically edible. Enter dried figs, olives, roasted chickpeas, nuts, and hunks of aged goat cheese, so firm they could double as projectiles. These were the granola bars of the ancient world, compact, rugged, and emotionally indifferent. Dried figs were a favorite. Portable, sticky, and packed with sugar and energy, they gave Alexander a quick burst of stamina, which was handy when you were conquering cities before lunch. Olives were salty, oily, and known to stain your tunic at inopportune diplomatic moments. But hey, electrolytes. Roasted chickpeas, meanwhile, were the popcorn of antiquity. Crunchy, satisfying, and plentiful, though tragically unbuttered. And nuts, especially almonds and walnuts, provided protein, fat, and something to chew on while debating whether to cross another mountain range. Alexander's commanders likely carried similar fare, sometimes wrapped in cloth, or stored in small leather pouches. No Tupperware, no airtight bags, just dust-covered finger food handed around between sword fights. And of course there was always RD. Not intentionally consumed, but practically unavoidable. Everything had a layer of it. The bread, the meat, the figs. There's a reason ancient armies were lean. They were constantly chewing on sand and pretending it was seasoning. Some accounts even suggest that Alexander, despite having access to finer things, often chose to eat like his soldiers. He didn't want to appear distant or pampered and snacking on goat cheese while sitting on a rock with your men. That's ancient military relatability 101. So no, royal snacks weren't decadent. They were durable, functional, and flavored mostly by the environment, which for Alexander tasted like ambition, arty, grime, and the occasional fig. Every empire has its moments of culinary excess, and Alexander's conquests were no exception. While his daily meals were often practical and ascetic, there were occasional banquets, particularly after victories, where things went weird. Not passing the salt is weird. More like, is that a fire-breathing dancer? Weird. Victory feasts were diplomatic theater meets calorie binge. You'd have Persian nobles trying not to weep into their golden napkins, Macedonian soldiers wondering if honey lizard was a joke, and Alexander sitting at the head of it all, attempting to keep things from descending into interpretive, wine-fueled warfare. These banquets were filled with roasted animals too large for one table, bowls of pomegranate-drenched rice, pastry shaped like birds, and wine poured by men wearing more jewelry than clothes. There were also live performances, music, poetry, acrobats, possibly an elephant or two doing something symbolic and vaguely threatening. But the real chaos came with the toasts. In Macedonian tradition, drinking wasn't just encouraged, it was practically weaponized. Men would try to out-toast one another in volume of wine and emotional monologue. It started with Alexander and ended with someone shouting, "I would die for your sandals," while weeping into a leg of lamb. One of the most famous banquets gone rogue occurred in Samarkand, where Alexander tried to merge Macedonian and Persian traditions by having both peoples feast together as equals. Beautiful idea, a logistical nightmare. Language barriers, cultural misunderstandings, and the fact that Persian cuisine included sauces. While Macedonian cuisine considered salt an indulgence, it was bound to end in someone flipping a platter. Sometimes the weirdness was unintentional, like when Alexander hosted a banquet in a city that had been recently conquered and still smelled like smoke, or when people brought extravagant tribute dishes, live peacocks, honey-glazed camel, allegedly, or a pudding that required 6 servants and divine patience. These feasts were more than just meals. They were political statements, unity stunts, morale boosters, and occasional lessons in why you don't let the guy from Thrace near the wine amphora. So yes, Alexander could throw a party. But even then, he often ate sparingly, drank carefully, and watched everything like a man who knew history was always taking notes. By the time Alexander reached Babylon, he wasn't just a king. He was a global brand with a diet that now included elements from Greece, Persia, India, and whatever that thing was they roasted in Bactria. Babylon, of course, rolled out the red carpet, and by red carpet we mean feasts that made Olympic opening ceremonies look like potlucks. This was the culinary climax of his journey. Babylonian chefs were masters of opulence. They had access to grain-fed lamb, spice-date wine, cooked fruits, and endless sauces, all served with flair and usually on something gold. Meals came in courses with music, incense, and the faint scent of either glory or exhaustion. Maybe both. Alexander's table was now a geopolitical event. Sitting beside him, Persian satraps, Indian emissaries, Greek generals, and probably a philosopher or two pretending they weren't deeply uncomfortable with cumin. Yet despite the spectacle, Alexander still ate simply most of the time. He didn't gorge. He didn't drape himself in honey. He kept the old habits. Bread, meat, maybe a little wine, even his peacocks stuffed with dates paraded by one part discipline, one part political messaging. Yes, I rule the world, but I'm still humble enough to chew jerky like a field grunt. And then, the final feast came. Accounts vary wildly, as ancient historians weren't exactly known for fact-checking, but most agree Alexander attended a massive banquet, possibly in honor of a god, a friend, or just surviving another Thursday. There was food, there was a lot of wine, and sometime afterward he fell ill. Was it poisoning, a fever, malaria, liver failure from years of high-functioning world domination? We'll never know. What we do know is that for 11 days Alexander lay bedridden, unable to speak, eat, or rise. The man who consumed continents could barely sip water. There's no detailed record of his last meal. It probably wasn't grand. It might have been a cup of wine, or just a damp cloth on his lips. In the end, the conqueror of empires went the way of all mortals, quietly, humbly, and possibly hungry. So ended the feasting. So ended the man. And in Babylon, the banquet tables were cleared and history took its seat. Let's imagine just for a moment that Alexander the Great wandered into the modern world, dusty cape, sword at his side, a little confused by escalators, and found himself standing in line at a food court. What would he order? Let's be clear. Alexander wasn't a man for fluff. He didn't suffer from the decision, and he certainly didn't believe in building your own bowl. He'd scan the options, fusion tacos, rainbow smoothies, deep-fried everything, and likely settle on something simple, affordable, and protein-packed. He'd skip the sugar-crusted trend foods and probably head straight for a lamb gyro, nodding approvingly at the roast meat spinning like a mini war chariot. Barley-based energy bars. Familiar territory. Lentil soup. A nostalgic favorite. Grilled onions. Yes, but only if the smell reminded him of conquest and poor impulse control. Fast food would puzzle him, but military efficiency might win him over. The idea of food being ready in under 2 minutes would have felt like witchcraft in Macedon, though he'd probably want to inspect the kitchen and possibly conquer it. If forced to deal with a modern menu, he'd have questions. Why is this called a Caesar salad? Was he not stabbed in the forum? Why is this chicken General Tso's? What army did he command? And upon tasting a milkshake, this is delightful. What animal did you milk to get sugar? Health-wise, he probably thrived. His original diet, light on carbs, heavy on walking 20 miles before breakfast, was already influencer approved. Paleo. He basically invented it. Keto. That's just campaign season. Yet even with all this novelty, it's likely Alexander would still crave simplicity. A flatbread, some roasted meat, a cup of wine. Mixed, of course, because he wasn't a barbarian. No glittery cupcakes, no avocado toast. Definitely no food served in a mason jar. Why? Because Alexander wasn't just a man of appetite. He was a man of purpose. Food was fuel, a tool, occasionally a morale booster, but never the main event. So if you ever find yourself debating what to order while feeling deeply indecisive, just ask yourself, would Alexander eat this or would he annex it? And suddenly that lentil wrap might not look so boring after all in the waning days of the ancient world. When the Mediterranean's greatest minds still gathered beneath colonnades and argued over the nature of the cosmos, a woman named Hypatia stood at the center of it all. Born around 360 CE in the intellectual melting pot of Alexandria, she was not supposed to lead, not according to the customs of the time. Yet there she was, not just participating in philosophy and science, but excelling in them. Her father, Theon, was a respected mathematician and philosopher. Associated with the Great Museum of Alexandria, a center of learning that still echoed the fading legacy of the once mighty library. But while most fathers taught their sons to read and write, Theon went all in on his daughter. He trained Hypatia in arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and Platonic philosophy. She didn't just memorize theories, she questioned them, debated them, and taught them. By the time she reached adulthood, Hypatia had outpaced her father in both intellect and influence. Her lectures drew students from across the empire, pagans, Christians, skeptics, and zealots alike. She taught openly in the streets and lecture halls, wrapped in her philosopher's cloak, commanding attention not with authority but with clarity. She explained celestial motion, conic sections, and the properties of numbers with such brilliance that people described her as nearly divine. And this was not some cloistered scholar hidden in dusty rooms. Hypatia moved freely through the male-dominated world of late Roman Egypt, offering counsel to city officials and even Roman governors. She embodied the old world, the classical world, one that was slipping fast beneath the tides of religious transformation and imperial instability. But Alexandria was no longer just a city of books. It was also a battleground of faiths, Christianity rising, paganism waning, and politics becoming more dangerous than any equation. Hypatia's fame, her independence, and her status as a symbol of rational, classical thought began to stir envy and resentment among those who preferred revelation over reason. Still, in those early years, she was untouchable. Hypatia was the final light of a fading era, a woman revered not because she fit into the world of men, but because she rose far above it. In an age when women were expected to marry, bear children, and stay far from the lecture halls, Hypatia did something profoundly subversive. She chose the life of the mind. And more importantly, Alexandria let her. Sort of. Her presence was radical. But her intellect made it hard to argue with her. Hypatia didn't claw her way into intellectual circles. She was invited. Her mastery of mathematics and astronomy placed her at the forefront of Neoplatonism, a philosophical movement blending the teachings of Plato with elements of mysticism. Think lofty ideas about the soul's journey, the nature of ultimate reality, and the ladder between the material and divine, all delivered with geometric precision. Hypatia's lectures weren't just academic snooze fests either. Her reputation was magnetic. Students came not just from Alexandria, but from all corners of the empire, eager to sit at her feet. Many of them were upper-class Roman men who, paradoxically, learned about logic and discipline from a woman whom their own societies would have silenced. She taught publicly, not in secret. She rode through the city in her philosopher's cloak, commanding attention in forums and amphitheaters, often giving speeches in front of mixed crowds. It wasn't just her knowledge that captivated, it was her character. Hypatia was famously ascetic, uninterested in wealth or pleasure. She remained unmarried, perhaps deliberately, to maintain her independence and philosophical purity. According to one story, likely apocryphal but still telling, when a student tried to pursue her romantically, she shut him down by flinging a bloody menstrual rag at him and declaring, "This is what you love, young man, not beauty." Point taken. Yet despite her stoicism, she wasn't cold. Many of her students adored her, not just as a teacher, but as a moral guide. Some went on to become bishops, judges, and governors. In particular, Synesius of Cyrene, one of her most devoted students, later became a Christian bishop, yet maintained his reverence for Hypatia for life, writing letters to her that read like a combination of fan mail, philosophical inquiry, and spiritual therapy. She wasn't just a scholar. She was the embodiment of Alexandria's ancient soul, scientific, philosophical, tolerant, and dangerously brilliant in a world growing more intolerant by the day. By the time Hypatia reached her intellectual prime, the Library of Alexandria, once the crown jewel of human knowledge, was a ghost of its former self. The original structure had been destroyed in waves of war, neglect, and political chaos. What remained was scattered across the city, annexes, scrolls stashed in private collections, and a few scholars still clinging to the dream of universal knowledge. Among them, none shone brighter than Hypatia, though she wasn't the official librarian of what was left. Many considered her the de facto heir. To that legacy, she edited and preserved important mathematical texts, most notably works by Diophantus and Apollonius. Some scholars believe she even contributed to the design of the astrolabe and the hydrometer, tools crucial to astronomy and measurement. That's right, she wasn't just theorizing about the stars, she was helping build the instruments used to observe them. And then there was her commentary on Ptolemy's Almagest, a complex astronomical treatise filled with math-heavy models explaining planetary motion. Most people couldn't even pronounce it, let alone improve it. But Hypatia's revisions made the work more accessible for future generations, ensuring its survival through the ages. Ironically, her edits would become standard in Arabic translations centuries later, long after the Roman world had forgotten her name. But Hypatia wasn't hoarding knowledge. She believed in sharing it relentlessly. Her classroom was wherever she stood, whether diagramming parabolas or deconstructing Plato's forms. She never treated science and philosophy as separate domains. To her, they were united, the mind and the cosmos, one vast, interconnected system. This belief made her revered, but also vulnerable, because Alexandria was changing. Christian bishops were gaining power, temples were being converted into churches, and suspicion of pagan knowledge was growing. Hypatia, a philosopher rooted in classical tradition, began to be seen not just as a teacher, but as a threat. A woman who taught astronomy instead of theology, who questioned rather than obeyed, who remained publicly unaffiliated with any religion. It didn't matter that some of her students were Christians, or that she showed no open hostility to the church. What mattered was the symbolism. Hypatia represented the old world, one of reason and inquiry, and in a city that was turning toward dogma, that was more dangerous than any scroll. By the early 5th century, Alexandria was no longer the serene cradle of learning it once aspired to be. It was a pressure cooker of religious fury, political rivalries, and street-level violence. Hypatia, whether she liked it or not, had become more than just a philosopher. She was now a symbol, and symbols tend to attract mobs. The tension in the city was palpable. On one side stood the pagan and intellectual elite, still clinging to the remnants of Greco-Roman culture. On the other, the rising tide of Christianity, no longer a persecuted faith, but now an assertive, politically dominant force. And in the middle were Roman administrators trying to hold the peace with all the effectiveness of a man trying to mop the ocean. The newly appointed Christian bishop of Alexandria, Cyril, was ambitious, influential, and eager to cement the church's authority over the city. His rival was Orestes, the Roman governor, a Christian himself, but politically cautious and somewhat more tolerant of Alexandria's traditional pluralism. The two men loathed each other, and in that boiling cauldron of hostility, Hypatia unintentionally became a lightning rod. She had the respect of Orestes, often serving as a trusted advisor, but she remained staunchly neutral in religion, refusing to convert, refusing to take sides and refusing to disappear. That, in a time when neutrality was seen as betrayal, was a problem. The Christian population, particularly its more militant factions, began whispering that Hypatia was the reason Orestes and Cyril were locked in conflict, that she was casting spells, manipulating politics with pagan sorcery, holding Alexandria back from its Christian destiny. It was, of course, nonsense, but when a city is drunk on zeal and blood, nonsense spreads faster than reason. At the same time, a group known as the Parabolani, essentially religious enforcers, or monks with muscles, were gaining influence under Cyril. Originally created to tend to the sick and bury the dead, they increasingly resembled a paramilitary force enforcing church authority on the streets. And there was Hypatia, brilliant, independent, respected by Roman power, unrepentantly pagan in her worldview, calmly riding her chariot through town like she didn't have a target painted on her back. But in Alexandria's new order, no one stood above the crossfire for long. Cyril of Alexandria did not come to power with meek intentions. Succeeding his uncle Theophilus as bishop in 412 CE, Cyril inherited a church ready to dominate, and he had no interest in being merely a spiritual leader. He was a man who wielded theology like a sword and politics like a dagger, in Alexandria, fragmented by ideology. It was the perfect place to wage his campaign. Cyril's mission was twofold: to root out heresy and to assert the supremacy of the church over civil authority. And he wasted no time. He closed Novatian churches, expelled Jews from the city, and expanded his influence over both the pulpit and the street. His sermons didn't just inspire, they mobilized. He knew the power of spectacle, of aligning divine rhetoric with physical force. And the Parabolani, that unofficial militant arm of the church, became his boots on the ground. Naturally, this didn't sit well with Orestes, the imperial governor. Though a Christian, Orestes upheld Rome's long-standing policy of religious tolerance. He resisted Cyril's aggressive moves, particularly those that infringed upon civil law. Their relationship went downhill faster than a marble rolling down a temple staircase. Orestes tried diplomacy. He tried containment. What he got in return was violence. When a Christian mob attempted to assassinate him, hurling stones during a public address, and one monk, Ammonius, was arrested and executed for the attack, Cyril hailed him as a martyr. The rift was now an open wound, and caught in this high-stakes power struggle was Hypatia, respected by Orestes, resented by Cyril's followers, and impossible to ignore. She wasn't overtly political, but her intellect and influence made her a threat. Her very existence undermined the idea that wisdom flowed only through the church. A woman, a pagan, an astronomer, and a close advisor to Cyril's greatest political enemy. It didn't matter that Hypatia had no army, no ambition for office. In a city where theology and power were now indistinguishable, neutrality was the most dangerous position of all. And Cyril's silence on the growing whispers against her will prove deafening, because in Alexandria, when people start pointing fingers at witches, it's only a matter of time before someone lights the fire. By 414 CE, Alexandria had become a city where truth was no longer required for conviction, only suspicion and a crowd. Hypatia, once celebrated across the empire as a philosopher of unmatched brilliance, was now being recast in darker tones by her enemies. Whispers spread like plague that she was a sorceress, that she kept Orestes under her spell, that she was plotting against the church. None of it had any factual basis, but facts were no longer fashionable. Much of the propaganda against Hypatia played on her visibility. She was a public figure, riding in her chariot, teaching in the open, consulting with high officials. That sort of confidence in a woman, no less, offended the rigid worldview taking root among Alexandria's religious hardliners. To them, Hypatia represented everything that was wrong with the old world. She was female, philosophical, and definitely unconverted. Rumors claimed she worshipped demons, that she practiced dark arts, that her astrolabes were magical instruments used to bend the will of men. In reality, they were just scientific tools. But science, in an age gripped by religious extremism, it can look an awful lot like sorcery to those who don't understand it or don't want to. One story even accused her of preventing reconciliation between Orestes and Bishop Cyril. The logic was as follows. Hypatia advised Orestes. Orestes opposed Cyril. Therefore, Hypatia must be the root of the conflict. A tidy little syllogism. Convenient, simple, and lethally wrong. The streets buzzed with unrest. It was no longer a matter of if something would happen to Hypatia, but when and how violently. The Parabolani, once caretakers of the poor, had fully transformed into zealots itching for a cause, and the city's Christian majority, already primed to see Hypatia as a dangerous pagan which needed only the faintest nod to act. That nod never came publicly from Cyril. He was too careful for that, but his refusal to condemn the rumors, to quell the hysteria, to publicly defend a woman he surely knew was innocent, spoke volumes. Silence, after all, is just another kind of signal. And so the trap closed slowly, invisibly around Hypatia, not with chains, but with whispers and pointed fingers. The kind of prison you never see until it's too late. It happened in the spring of 415 CE. Hypatia, now in her mid-50s, still rode her chariot through Alexandria's streets, still taught her students, and still dared to exist in defiance of the narrative her enemies had crafted. She likely knew the danger. The glances had turned hostile, the whispers sharper, and the atmosphere thick with menace. But she carried on a living rebuke to fanaticism. And then one day they came for her. It wasn't an organized trial or an official execution. It was a mob, frenzied, righteous, and brimming with hate, led by the Parabolani and allegedly stirred by a man named Peter, a reader in a church. They intercepted her in the streets. She was dragged from her chariot, stripped of her clothing, and hauled into a church building, a sacred space turned into a butcher's den. What happened next is difficult to describe without flinching contemporary accounts, particularly that of the historian Socrates Scholasticus. Say the mob murdered her with roof tiles or oyster shells, flaying the flesh from her bones. Others say they tore her body apart, limb by limb. What we do know is that after they killed her, they burned the remains, an extra insult, as if erasing every trace of her existence would somehow make the deed righteous. It was a murder not of policy, but of passion, the kind fueled by ideology, not legality. No trial, no verdict, just execution by rage. Alexandria lost more than a woman that day. It lost its last voice of the classical tradition, its last public philosopher, and arguably its last claim to the cosmopolitan spirit that had once defined it. Orestes was powerless to respond. Cyril. He expressed regret, but distanced himself from any responsibility. There were no arrests, no public inquiry. The silence that had preceded Hypatia's death was followed by more silence, and then gradually forgetting. But the damage was done. With Hypatia's death, the symbolic door slammed shut on antiquity's age of reason. It marked the end of Alexandria as an intellectual capital and the beginning of its descent into theological rigidity. Her mutilated body was the final punctuation mark. In centuries of slow cultural erosion, a scholar was killed. A world was lost. In the weeks following Hypatia's brutal murder, Alexandria fell eerily quiet. Not because peace had returned, but because something essential had died. The streets still bustled, churches still rang with chants, bureaucrats still stamped scrolls. But the soul of the city, that open exchange of thought, that synthesis of Greek philosophy, Roman governance, and Egyptian mysticism had dimmed forever. There was no justice for Hypatia, no trial, no restitution. Orestes, already weakened, eventually disappeared from the historical record. Some say he left Alexandria, too politically isolated to govern. Others say he was recalled to Rome. Either way, the one man in power who had tried to shield her was gone. And Bishop Cyril? He emerged from the crisis stronger than ever. Though Cyril denied involvement in her death, many saw his silence and rhetoric as tacit approval. He made no effort to punish the killers. He never condemned the act publicly. In time, he was even canonized. Cyril of Alexandria, remembered more for his battles against heresy than the philosopher whose blood had been spilled under his watch. As for Hypatia, her legacy was swiftly buried, not just physically, but intellectually. Her name was scrubbed from many records. Her writings were lost, her teachings attributed to others, her contributions to mathematics and astronomy scattered across history with faint traces of authorship. In the blink of a historical eye, one of the most brilliant minds of late antiquity was turned into a whisper. But whispers linger. Centuries later, Hypatia's story began to resurface, first in the writings of Renaissance humanists, who saw in her a martyr for reason, then in Enlightenment salons, where she became a symbol of intellectual freedom suppressed by dogma. By the 19th and 20th centuries, she was elevated once again, the woman philosopher, the last guardian of Alexandria's ancient wisdom, a tragic figure whose death marked the twilight of classical civilization. Still, what we know about Hypatia today comes largely from the accounts of men, students like Synesius, historians like Socrates Scholasticus, and chroniclers from a later time trying to piece together a shattered mosaic. The woman herself. Her voice was silenced, but her silence became thunder, despite the centuries of silence. Hypatia refused to be forgotten. Her name, once nearly erased, resurfaced in every age that questioned authority and valued the pursuit of truth. She became more than a historical figure. She became a symbol, not just of a murdered scholar, but of an idea. That reason must stand its ground, even when the world turns violent. During the Renaissance, thinkers rediscovered her story and held her up as a martyr to ignorance. In the Enlightenment, philosophers and skeptics pointed to Hypatia as proof of what happens when religion crushes inquiry. Voltaire wrote of her with fury, portraying her death as the final nail in the coffin of classical learning. She was cast as a tragic heroine in plays, poems, and later novels. Often exaggerated, yes, but always admired. In modern times, her story has inspired scientists, feminists, and secularists alike. To mathematicians, she's one of the earliest recorded women in the field, a forerunner to those still fighting for representation in STEM today. To women in philosophy, she's an ancient pioneer, one who didn't just participate in intellectual life but helped shape it. And to humanists, she's a stark reminder of how fragile knowledge can be when confronted by fear. But Hypatia's legacy is more than symbolic. Though most of her written work has vanished, scholars suspect her influence remains embedded in the survival of Greek mathematical texts. Her editions and commentaries likely became the versions that filtered into Arabic and later European scholarship. So even in silence, her fingerprints remained on the instruments of learning. There's a profound irony in that the mob that tore her apart sought to destroy not just the woman, but everything she stood for. And yet Hypatia endured, not in temples or churches, but in the minds of generations who refused to let her name vanish. Today, statues bear her likeness, schools carry her name, and thinkers from all walks of life invoke her memory when the world begins to slip into ignorance. She stands not just as the last light of Alexandria, but as a challenge to each of us. To speak clearly, think boldly, and never cower before the mob. Because truth, like Hypatia, may bleed, but it does not break. Beneath the quiet stretch of the Italian Alps, just 30 miles from Turin, lies a secret that defies belief. It's not marked on any old map, nor advertised to tourists. There are no Roman ruins, no medieval cathedrals. Instead, concealed beneath the mountain village of Vidraco is an immense hand-carved underground complex, a labyrinth of sacred chambers known as the temples of humankind. And for nearly 2 decades, no one outside a small spiritual community even knew they were there. This isn't some minor cave with a few frescoes. The temples stretch across 5 levels, connected by passageways, spiral staircases, and domes that could rival the architecture of great cathedrals. They are covered in sacred art, mosaics, stained glass, cosmic symbology, and golden altars, all chiseled, painted, and installed by hand. It's as if someone tried to recreate the Sistine Chapel underground, then added Egyptian hieroglyphs, Buddhist mandalas, Mayan glyphs, and galactic maps for good measure. And who built it? Not the Vatican. Not an esoteric order with centuries of tradition. No, it was a relatively unknown spiritual collective calling themselves Damanhur, named after the ancient Egyptian city believed to be the center of Horus worship. Founded in 1975, the group envisioned a society based on harmony, self-sufficiency, and spiritual evolution. The temples were their physical manifestation of that dream, a sacred space meant to realign human consciousness with the universe. Construction began in 1978, spearheaded by Oberto Irati, a former insurance broker turned mystic visionary. Without permission, Without blueprints and using only hand tools, Irati and his followers burrowed into the rock beneath a private house. They worked at night, used removed soil to landscape the hills, and told no one. It was a kind of spiritual resistance, building in secret what they believed could not be built in public, and they got away with it for 17 years. No one suspected that behind the unassuming facade of a countryside home, a team of artists, engineers, and believers was carving a subterranean wonder. Not until a disgruntled former member tipped off the authorities in the 1990s, and the Italian police expected to find a bunker or tax shelter, came face to face with one of the most astonishing underground structures in modern Europe. The temples of humankind didn't appear out of nowhere. They were the result of a grand, highly unconventional vision born in the mind of a man named Roberto Arati, later known to his followers as Falco. In the 1970s, Arati wasn't yet a spiritual guru. He worked a fairly ordinary job as an insurance agent in northern Italy. But beneath the surface, he was obsessed with metaphysics, reincarnation, ancient civilizations, and what he called the memory of the cosmos. Arati claimed that from a young age, he experienced vivid past life memories, not just vague impressions, but detailed visions of lives spent in lost civilizations, including Atlantis and ancient Egypt. He believed these memories weren't fantasies, but blueprints. And one of those blueprints, he said, was for a temple, not metaphorical but literal, a sanctuary for spiritual awakening, to be hidden underground and constructed by a community united in purpose. So in 1975, he gathered a small group of like-minded individuals in the Alpine foothills. They shared his dream of a self-sufficient, spiritually evolved society. The group took the name Damanhur after the Egyptian city of the same name. Believed to be the home of Horus worship and esoteric knowledge, their mission wasn't to start a new religion, but to build a new kind of society, one that balanced science, art, ecology, and spirituality. Damanhur grew quietly. Members gave up their previous lives to join communal living in the Italian countryside. They practiced meditation, sacred dance, and a made-up language they believed enhanced communication on a subtle level. They developed their own currency. They studied ancient texts and claimed to communicate with trees to outsiders. It all seemed charming at best, eccentric at worst. But to Irati's followers, they were laying the groundwork for a cosmic rebirth. Beneath all of it, though, was the real secret. Construction had already begun. Arati claimed he had seen the temple in visions and believed it was his destiny to build it. With picks, hammers, buckets, and unwavering conviction, Damanhurians began excavating, not knowing if they'd ever finish, or if they'd be caught. They weren't just digging into stone, they were digging into belief itself, and shaping a sanctuary meant not for the present, but for a future they believed was coming. From the outside, the house at the top of the hill in Vidraco looked utterly ordinary, just a modest alpine home perched quietly above the valley. But beneath its floors, behind a secret trap door hidden under a carpet, lay the mouth of an ever-growing tunnel. It was here, under cover of night and silence, that the people of Damanhur undertook what can only be described as an architectural miracle, building a sprawling underground temple by hand. Construction began in 1978. There were no cranes, no backhoes, no engineering teams in hard hats, just a handful of people with pickaxes, hammers, and lanterns. They tunneled into solid rock with basic tools, removing the debris bucket by bucket, often working through the night to avoid detection. The excavated earth was quietly distributed across the landscape, used to shape gardens and terraces, leaving no sign that anything was happening below. It was incredibly dangerous. The work wasn't sanctioned. There were no safety codes. A single mistake could have triggered a collapse and buried them alive. But the Damanhurians believed they were protected by faith, destiny, and the guidance of higher intelligences. This wasn't just construction, it was a sacred ritual. Every strike of the hammer was a devotional act. Irati, or Falco, claimed he had already seen the temple in a vision. Every room, every hall, every golden altar. His sketches guided the layout, domes representing different spiritual principles, interconnected by passageways filled with art and light. Each chamber had a function: meditation, healing, energy alignment. The architecture was driven by sacred geometry and esoteric symbolism, not modern utility. Even as more members joined the project, the secrecy held. Families passed down stories of their children growing up playing above the temple floor, completely unaware of what was beneath their feet. Somehow, for nearly 15 years, no neighbor reported strange activities. No curious local stumbled into the wrong doorway. No authority knocked at the door. By the early 1990s, they had carved out an underground space large enough to house several floors of elaborately decorated halls without a single outsider knowing. It was a feat of human persistence, madness, artistry, or perhaps all three. They weren't just building a temple. They were defying the modern world by proving something ancient could still be born hidden beneath it. For nearly 17 years, the temples of humankind remained one of the best-kept secrets in modern Europe. But as with all secrets, this one eventually surfaced, not with a whisper, but with a bang. In 1992, a former Damen Hur member, bitter over a dispute with the leadership, decided to report the existence of the underground complex to the Italian authorities. He claimed there was an enormous illegal structure buried beneath the Alps, one not registered, not inspected, and definitely not approved. To the government, it sounded absurd. An entire temple system built by a cult without anyone noticing. Still, officials were obligated to investigate. When police arrived at the site in Vidraco, they expected, at most, an unauthorized basement, or perhaps a small bunker. What they found was beyond anything they had prepared for. Upon entering through the concealed trapdoor, they descended into vast chambers, glittering with mosaics, golden altars, and stained glass windows, all underground. Marble pillars, vaulted domes, sacred symbology from every known spiritual tradition. The officers were stunned. Some reports say they believed they had discovered a lost civilization. The sheer size and artistry of the temples defied logic. This wasn't just a secret room. This was a multi-level architectural wonder carved out of bedrock, hidden in plain sight. News of the discovery spread quickly, and public reaction was a chaotic mix of fascination, outrage, and bureaucratic panic. The Italian government was initially alarmed, issued an immediate stop work order, and threatened to seal the complex permanently. After all, no permits had been filed, and there were serious concerns about structural safety. But something unexpected happened. Instead of recoiling in fear or ridicule, the public was intrigued. Photos of the chambers, particularly the Hall of Mirrors and the Blue Temple, began circulating in Italian newspapers. People were captivated. Who were these people? How did they build this, and why? Damen Hur, now facing extinction or acclaim, chose to open its doors. They invited officials, journalists, even skeptical scientists to tour the temples. And what they saw was undeniable. Not the work of a cult, but a monumental, artistic, and spiritual endeavor. In trying to bury their vision, Damen Hur had created a marvel, and now, the world wanted it. Once the cat was out of the cosmic bag, there was no going back. With the threat of demolition looming, the Damen Hur community made a bold choice: complete transparency. Rather than deny or hide their creation, they invited the world inside. It was a calculated risk, but it paid off spectacularly. Journalists, archaeologists, engineers, and even skeptical government officials were escorted down into the mountain to see what had been carved beneath their feet. And what they found was less secret cult lair and more underground. Vatican meets Gordy's subconscious. There was the Hall of Mirrors, a massive chamber with mirrored walls, stained glass ceilings, and tiled floors that reflected light like a kaleidoscope of energy. There was the Hall of Earth, shaped like a chalice. Dedicated to the feminine principle and ancient earth goddesses, each temple was designed with precision, not only artistically but energetically, aligned with what the Damen Hurians believed were synchronic lines, cosmic pathways of energy crisscrossing the earth. The architecture was built to resonate with these lines, amplifying their effects and turning the space into a kind of spiritual engine. Italian authorities are now facing public fascination and media buzz. Had a problem on their hands. Yes, the temples were technically illegal, but demolishing them would mean destroying a modern artistic marvel that had captured the public's imagination. In a rare twist of bureaucratic mercy, the government chose to regulate instead of erase. Rather than shut the complex down, they allowed Damanhur to retain ownership under strict safety and preservation guidelines. Engineers reviewed the structural integrity. Historians cataloged the symbolism. Artists simply stood in awe. By the mid-1990s, the temples of humankind had been transformed from a forbidden mystery into a cultural phenomenon. The group launched guided tours and spiritual retreats. Filmmakers and photographers documented the halls. Critics remained, of course, but curiosity far outweighed condemnation. What had once been hidden was now open to the world, and in a strange reversal. The very secrecy that once protected the temples had become their greatest marketing tool. People didn't just come to see art. They came to stand inside a miracle that wasn't supposed to exist. The mountain had kept its secret. Now it whispered to everyone. To the untrained eye, the temples of humankind might seem like an eclectic art project gone off the rails. All colors, symbols, and cosmic flair. But to the Damanhurians, every square inch has purpose. This wasn't just a sacred space. It was a machine for consciousness, a metaphysical tool designed to amplify spiritual energy, awaken latent human potential, and realign humanity with the cosmos. At the core of Damanhur's philosophy is the belief that Earth is crisscrossed by synchronic lines, energetic currents similar to ley lines or acupuncture meridians. These lines, they say, connect powerful sites across the planet. The pyramids, Stonehenge, Machu Picchu, and now the underground temples in Vidraco. The temples were not randomly placed. They were intentionally built at the intersection of these lines, making them, in Damanhurian logic, a sort of interdimensional charging station. Each chamber within the temples reflects a different spiritual concept. The Hall of Water, for instance. It is dedicated to past lives and emotional healing. The Hall of Spheres is considered the temple's energetic nucleus, a place intended to communicate with higher intelligences and distant civilizations. No, not metaphorically. The Damanhurians genuinely believe that consciousness exists beyond Earth, and that the temples act as a beacon. It's not just symbolic. The community incorporates sound, geometry, and material resonance into the architecture to activate these energies. Walls are embedded with copper coils. Quartz crystals are positioned to reflect frequencies. Every element, from colors to symbols to materials, is chosen based on how it resonates with human consciousness and planetary harmonics. Visitors often describe strange experiences, feeling waves of energy, hearing unexplained tones, or entering altered states of awareness. Whether placebo or power grid, the temples do seem to have an effect. Even skeptical scientists have noted unusually strong electromagnetic activity in some chambers. But for the Damanhurian faithful, science only confirms what they already know. This is a living temple, one that interacts with intention, emotion, and thought. It is a bridge, not just between Earth and the stars, but between what we are and what we could become. In their eyes, the temples of humankind are not a relic of the past, but a prototype for the future. While the underground temples are the most visually spectacular part of Damanhur, they are only one piece of a much larger spiritual experiment. Above ground, the Federation of Damanhur functions as a kind of intentional micronation, complete with its own constitution, currency, schools, and even a timekeeping system. That's right. They use their own calendar, which started in 1975, the year the Federation was founded. In Damanhurian reckoning, we are currently in year 50. The community is organized into eco-villages, each with a specific purpose. Farming, arts, research, healing, or temple work. Daily life blends the mystical with the mundane. Residents grow their own food, participate in group meditations, and meet for weekly social alchemy sessions designed to align the individual's spiritual progress with the group's collective evolution. At its peak, Damanhur boasted over 1,000 members from more than 30 countries. Newcomers don't just join casually, they undergo an initiation process and are encouraged to live communally, give up some personal possessions, and contribute their skills to the collective. Professions range from sculptors to software developers. Everyone is expected to contribute to the whole. Education plays a huge role in Damanhurian life. Children are taught not only math and language, but also sacred geometry, ancient mythology, and energy awareness. There's even a Damanhurian university offering courses in esoteric sciences, spiritual physics, and alternative healing methods. If it sounds like Hogwarts with solar panels, you're not far off. At the philosophical center of it all is the idea that divinity exists in all things, and that humanity's purpose is to awaken to its role as co-creator with the universe. This means living harmoniously with nature, exploring consciousness, and using creativity as a spiritual tool. To outsiders, the community can seem eccentric, even cult-like. But there's no single deity, no enforced dogma, and no charismatic tyrant. Leadership is democratic, and roles rotate. Members are free to leave, and many do. Critics exist. Some former members cite internal pressures, ideological rigidity, or burnout. But even critics admit it's unlike anything else on Earth. Damanhur isn't just a commune or a spiritual retreat. It's an ongoing social experiment, a place where people try in earnest to live a myth, not just read about one. To walk through the temples of humankind is to enter a universe made of symbols. Every wall, ceiling, and floor is layered with meaning. Mythological, mathematical, cosmological. But the Manhwa doesn't see art as mere decoration. Here, art is sacred technology, a tool to awaken the spirit, unlock ancient memory, and communicate with the divine without saying a single word. Their aesthetic is not random. It weaves together Egyptian iconography, Celtic spirals, Hindu deities, and futuristic star maps. One chamber might depict the Eye of Horus, while another features stylized DNA strands or planetary alignments. These are not just pretty patterns, they're intentional codes. Damanhurians believe these symbols speak to the soul's language, bypassing the rational mind and triggering deeper awareness. But why blend so many cultures and traditions? According to their teachings, all myths are fragments of a larger universal truth, stories told in different tongues, pointing to the same cosmic source. The temples aren't claiming to recreate any one religion. Instead, they seek to harmonize them all, not in a bland mashup, but as a deliberate integration of human spiritual history. Then there's the matter of language, or rather languages. Damanhur developed its own sacred language called Sacred Language. Not very original, but accurate. It consists of thousands of ideograms, each designed to express spiritual concepts that ordinary speech supposedly fails to capture. You'll find these glyphs carved into stone and glass throughout the temples, shimmering in gold leaf, etched into colored marble, floating above doorways like glowing spells to the community. These symbols aren't invented, they're remembered. Falco claimed that this language comes from ancient civilizations predating our recorded history, possibly even from extraterrestrial origins. In other words, the symbols are less created and more recovered, like spiritual fossils of an earlier, wiser age. Visitors often describe the experience of being inside the temples as emotional, even overwhelming. Many cry. Some say they feel a strange sense of familiarity, like they're remembering something long forgotten. And that's exactly the point. The temples aren't designed to explain. They're designed to evoke. Because in Damanhur, truth isn't taught. It's awakened through story, symbol, and the silence between words. The temples of humankind were never meant to be monuments to the past. They were, and still are, a blueprint for the future. Not just a spiritual future, but a cultural one where architecture, consciousness, and community fuse into something new. While the world above rushes forward with technology and division, the world beneath the Draco continues to expand slowly, intentionally, one brushstroke at a time. Even today, the temples are not finished. Damanhur considers them a living organism, constantly evolving. New chambers are added, old ones are renovated, murals are touched up, new symbols added to reflect the changing energy of community. Unlike traditional sacred sites frozen in time, the temples of humankind breathe. They grow with the people who built them. In the years since their discovery, Damanhur has expanded its global reach. The Federation now includes centers in other countries, online courses, and a stream of international visitors who come for spiritual retreats, energy healing, or simply curiosity. While some arrive expecting New Age fluff, many leave deeply affected, not necessarily converted, but moved by the sheer ambition of the place. After all, How many communities actually build cathedrals from scratch, underground, in secret? Yet Damanhur isn't without its critics. Skeptics raise eyebrows at some of its claims: past lives, synchronic lines, interstellar communication. Others worry about its cult-like intensity or the degree of devotion expected from members. But through it all, the Federation has endured not by isolating itself, but by opening its gates. Today, the temples are a symbol of possibility. What can be created when art, intention, and community come together? They remind us that the great sacred sites of the ancient world, the pyramids, the cathedrals, the ziggurats, weren't just buildings. They were expressions of collective belief. Damanhur dares to ask, why did we stop building like that? And maybe that's the legacy of the temples of humankind. Not their beliefs, but their boldness in a world obsessed with efficiency and spectacle. A group of ordinary people decided to dig into the earth and make something sacred by hand, in silence, for the sake of beauty and spirit. It's not just a temple. It's a question carved into stone. What are you creating with your life? Long before satellites orbited Earth or sailors shouted land ho, human beings were already on the move, tracing coastlines, crossing deserts, and scribbling their ideas of the world into clay, stone, or hide. Travel wasn't just about curiosity, it was about survival. The very first explorers weren't adventurers, they were gatherers and traders, hunters and refugees. But over time, movement became more than necessity. It became a strategy, and eventually it became a legacy. The earliest maps weren't grand cartographic masterpieces. They were scratched patterns on cave walls, carvings on bones, or mental images passed down orally. Around 2300 BCE, the Babylonians etched one of the first known maps onto a clay tablet, not of the world, but of a single region marked with rivers, towns, and mountains. To them, the Earth was a flat disk surrounded by a cosmic ocean with Babylon. Naturally, at the center, it wasn't geographically accurate, but it reflected something even more important. And then, these people wanted to understand their surroundings. They wanted to navigate. But how do you travel without roads, signage, or star charts? You watch the sun, you study the stars, you memorize the terrain, the migration of animals, the direction of the wind. And if you're lucky, you pass that knowledge to someone who remembers it better than you. Ancient Polynesians, for instance, mastered navigation using ocean swells, bird flight paths, and the position of constellations. Meanwhile, traders in Mesopotamia, Bohemia followed river routes like the Tigris and Euphrates, turning seasonal floods into shipping lanes. In these early civilizations, travel was rarely solo. It was communal, slow, and often dangerous. Travelers risked bandits, storms, disease, and simply getting lost forever. But they also brought goods, languages, ideas, and technologies across regions. Trade routes began to form like veins across the body of the ancient world. Exploration didn't need to reach new continents to be revolutionary. Sometimes it was enough to reach the next city-state, the next oasis, the next fertile valley. Those tiny steps created the web of interaction that would become civilization itself. So when we speak of ancient exploration, we're not just talking about distant journeys. We're talking about a primal urge to know what lies beyond the horizon and to leave a footprint on the unknown. The ancient Egyptians weren't known for wandering far and wide, but when they did travel, they did so with flair, ritual, and often an armed escort. The Nile was their highway, and it wasn't just for pleasure cruises. Pharaohs dispatched expeditions as to Nubia, into the Sinai, and even further into mysterious lands like Punt, a semi-mythical kingdom that Egyptians call God's land. Its location is still debated in Somalia, Eritrea, southern Arabia. No one's quite sure, but what's certain is that the Egyptians sent ships there loaded with goods and prayers, hoping to return with incense, gold, exotic animals, and a sense of divine prestige. One of the most famous recorded expeditions occurred during the reign of Queen Hatshepsut, Egypt's formidable female pharaoh. Around 1478 BCE, she launched a voyage to Punt, and proudly recorded the journey on the walls of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri. The carvings depict massive ships, men carrying retrieves, and locals with unusual features and elaborate headdresses. This wasn't just trade, it was diplomacy, propaganda, and spiritual alignment all rolled into one. Egyptians also ventured into the Sinai Peninsula, not just for conquest, but to mine turquoise and copper. These expeditions often involved hundreds of workers, scribes, soldiers, and priests. Travel was state-sponsored and heavily documented. Pharaohs weren't sending lone adventurers. They were deploying logistical machines. Officials recorded everything. What was mined, who participated, and how many offerings were made to the gods to ensure a safe journey. Despite being surrounded by deserts, Egypt wasn't isolated. Caravans moved through the western desert, connecting oases and bringing in goods from as far as Libya. Sea travel, though dangerous, allowed contact with Byblos, Crete, and other eastern Mediterranean ports. But make no mistake, ancient Egyptian travel was not easy. Whether by land or boat, expeditions were slow, risky, and costly. Yet they were seen as essential extensions of divine order when the pharaoh moved. Egypt moved, and every journey reinforced their worldview that Egypt was the center of the universe, and everything else, whether friend, foe, or foreign, existed to be known, tamed, or honored. For them, exploration was not rebellion against the gods. It was a service to them. If ancient Egypt looked inward toward its river and gods, the Phoenicians were the ones staring out across the sea and building ships to chase the horizon. Emerging around 1500 BCE from the coastal cities of Byblos, Tyre, and Sidon in present-day Lebanon, the Phoenicians didn't conquer land. They conquered water. And in doing so, they became the ancient world's most daring navigators and traders. They were not an empire in the traditional sense. No vast armies, no towering ziggurats, but they built something arguably more impressive, a network. The Phoenicians established trade routes that stretched across the Mediterranean, from the Levant to North Africa, to Cyprus, Sicily, Spain, and even to the mysterious edge of the Atlantic at the Strait of Gibraltar. Along the way, they founded cities, the most famous being Carthage, which would later rival Rome itself. What made them successful? Both sleek, fast, and durable. Phoenician ships were the marvels of their day. They used a combination of oars and sails, with high hulls for protection and curved designs that cut through waves. These weren't just transport vessels. They were floating marketplaces loaded with cedar wood, glassware, textiles dyed with their famous purple pigment, an alphabetic script carved into stone and traded like high-tech. Yes, the Phoenicians also gave us one of the greatest tools for human connection: the alphabet. Their script simplified writing, moving from cuneiform and hieroglyphs to a system of just 22 characters. It would go on to influence Greek, Latin, and eventually our modern alphabets. But travel for the Phoenicians wasn't without peril. Pirates prowled the waters, storms could crush ships into splinters, and every new harbor brought the risk of unfriendly locals or economic competition. Still, they persisted, not as conquerors, but as connectors. They brought tin from Britain, silver from Iberia, papyrus from Egypt, and spices from Arabia. Some sources, including Herodotus, even claim that Phoenician sailors, under Egyptian sponsorship, circumnavigated Africa as early as the 6th century BCE. That's a bold claim. But if anyone in the ancient world could have pulled off such a feat, it was probably the Phoenicians. They didn't build monuments. They built routes, and in doing so, mapped the heart of the ancient world through wind, wave, and trade. While Mediterranean sailors cut across waves and traded city to city far to the east, another kind of journey was unfolding, slower, dustier, and just as transformative. In ancient China, travel didn't mean ships on the sea. It meant caravans crossing deserts, winding through mountains, and braving some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. This was the beginning of what we now call the Silk Road, a vast network of overland routes that connected East Asia with the Middle East, Central Asia, and eventually Europe. Its origins trace back to the Han Dynasty around the 2nd century BCE, when the Emperor Wu of Han sent an emissary named Zhang Qian westward to establish alliances against nomadic invaders. Zhang Qian failed in his political mission. But in doing so, he accidentally discovered entire civilizations beyond China's western frontier. He returned years later with stories of Persian goods, Central Asian horses, and exotic cultures. The emperor wasn't thrilled about the delay. but he was fascinated by the possibilities. Trade routes blossomed. Chinese merchants began exporting silk, lacquerware, spices, jade, and porcelain. Products so desirable that they became status symbols from India to Rome. In return, caravans brought back horses, glassware, wool, and gold. But it wasn't just goods that traveled. Ideas, technologies, and religions crossed borders. Buddhism moved from India into China. Art styles merged. Instruments were exchanged. Even paper, invented in China, would eventually find its way west, revolutionizing written communication. But Silk Road travel was brutal. Caravans crossed the Taklamakan Desert, nicknamed the place from which no one returns. Sandstorms could bury travelers, thieves lurked in remote passes, and the sheer distance, thousands of miles from Chang'an modern Xi'an to cities like Samarkand or Antioch, could take months or even years. Travelers relied on oases, where small trading cities flourished like green jewels in the desert. Dunhuang, Kashgar, Merv. No single empire controlled the whole RD. It was kept alive by a patchwork of kingdoms, tribes, and city-states, each maintaining a piece of the route and taxing what passed through. And yet, despite its complexity, it worked, creating a web of connection that reshaped the ancient world. The Silk Road wasn't a single trail. It was a circulatory system, pumping life, belief, and ambition across continents. While deserts, rivers, and seas posed major obstacles to ancient travelers, the Persian Empire took a different approach. They built roads, long, durable, well-maintained roads, and not just for the sake of moving armies or goods. For the Achaemenid Persians, roads were the infrastructure of the empire itself, a way to tie together a patchwork of conquered lands, languages, and cultures into a single coherent system. At the heart of this vision was the Royal Road, commissioned by Darius the Great in the 5th century BCE, stretching over 1,500 miles from Susa in Persia to Sardis near the Aegean Sea. This highway connected the empire from east to west, enabling couriers, merchants, and military officers to traverse vast distances at unprecedented speed. Thanks to a system of relay stations with fresh horses and supplies, royal messengers could cover the entire route in just 7 to 9 days. A stunning achievement for the time. For comparison, the average traveler or caravan would take about 3 months. But the road wasn't just fast, it was secure. Patrols, fortifications, and outposts ensured safety for those who traveled under the king's banner. Travelers from across the empire, from Babylonian scribes to Greek diplomats, used the royal road not only to move goods, but to move ideas, rumors, and politics. In many ways, it became the empire's information superhighway. The Persian Empire's road system extended beyond the royal road, linking cities like Ecbatana, Persepolis, and Babylon, and stretching out toward Egypt, India, and Central Asia. Way stations called caravanserai offered rest and supplies for weary merchants and travelers. These structures would later become vital components of Islamic and Silk Road travel centuries down the line. More than just infrastructure, Persian roads symbolized the empire's desire to unite its many parts, not through force alone, but through connection. By standardizing coinage, weights, and languages used for official communication, the Persians made it easier for people to interact, trade, and participate in the imperial economy. In a world where most movement was slow and chaotic, Persia offered something revolutionary in order, structure, and a system designed for long-distance travel. In short, the Persians didn't just rule an empire, they engineered it. The Greeks weren't empire builders in the traditional sense, not early on at least. What they were, however, was incredibly curious. From Herodotus to Pythias, Greek travelers roamed the ancient world seeking knowledge, trade, and sometimes just pure wonder. Exploration for them wasn't always about conquest. It was a way to ask questions, collect stories, and map the unknown. One of the earliest and most fascinating explorers was Pythias of Massalia, modern Marseilles, who around 325 BCE sailed beyond the known world, through the Straits of Gibraltar, up the Atlantic coast, and allegedly all the way to a mysterious northern land he called Thule. Many scholars believe he may have reached Iceland or Norway. He described strange phenomena like the midnight sun and frozen seas, things Mediterranean readers thought were mythical. But Pythias wasn't a myth maker. He was a scientist with a sailor's heart. Meanwhile, in the eastern Mediterranean, Greek merchants and philosophers traveled across Egypt, Persia, and India. Alexander the Great's campaigns in the 4th century BCE blew the Greek world wide open, creating the Hellenistic era where Greek became a lingua franca from Athens to Bactria. Cities like Alexandria, Antioch, and Seleucia became crossroads for goods and ideas. Travel was no longer an exception, it was an expectation. Then came the Romans, the engineers of the empire. The Romans took travel and paved it quite literally. With their famous argy system, they connected cities across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. At its peak, the Roman Empire boasted over 250,000 miles of roads, including more than 50,000 miles of stone-paved highways. Roads like the Via Appia, built in 312 BCE, were feats of engineering designed to last, and many of them still exist today. Roman roads served the military first, enabling legions to move rapidly to crush rebellions, but they also enabled commerce, postal services, pilgrimages, and even tourism. Wealthy Romans visited Greek temples, Egyptian pyramids, and spa towns in Gaul. Guidebooks and travel anecdotes became popular reading. To the Romans, travel wasn't just practical, it was a statement. Roads proved the empire's reach. If a road led to your town, it meant you mattered. And with every mile laid in stone, Rome reshaped the ancient world's sense of distance and connection. While land routes like the Silk Road carried caravans through deserts and mountains, another network, just as vast and ancient, stretched across the waters of the Indian Ocean. These were the maritime silk routes connecting ports from East Africa to India, from the Arabian Peninsula to Southeast Asia. Long before the age of sail, sailors were navigating monsoon winds, crossing enormous distances and turning the ocean into a global marketplace. The key to it all? Monsoon winds, predictable seasonal currents that reverse direction each half of the year. Ancient mariners learned to time their journeys with the winds, heading east when they blew in from Africa and west when they reversed. With this knowledge, ships could reliably cross the open ocean, making voyages that once seemed impossible. Indian merchants sailed from Gujarat and the Tamil coast, exporting spices, textiles, gemstones, and ivory. In return, they imported horses, incense, gold, and even exotic animals. Arab traders from ports like Aden and Oman carried goods to and from the Persian Gulf, while East African merchants in places like Raptor traded ivory and tortoise-shell Chinese vessels. Especially during the Han and later Tang dynasties also ventured into the mix, exporting silk, ceramics, and lacquerware. By the 1st century CE, Greek and Roman ships were arriving in Indian ports like Uruk and Maziris, bypassing overland routes entirely. A Roman-era guidebook, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, describes in detail the bustling trade ports, goods exchanged and routes followed by sailors across the Indian Ocean. This wasn't speculation. It was a manual for navigating global commerce. But the sea wasn't just a place of trade. It was also a highway for ideas. Buddhism spread from India to Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia via maritime routes. Islamic traders later carried their faith across the Indian Ocean, shaping entire coastal cultures in East Africa and the Malay world. Unlike the often militarized overland empires, the Indian Ocean trade network thrived on pluralism and cooperation. Ports became melting pots of language, religion, and cuisine. A Tamil merchant, a Swahili sailor, a Yemeni imam, and a Chinese diplomat could all do business in the same harbor. In this ancient sea, the tides didn't just carry ships, they carried civilizations. Not all ancient travel was driven by trade, war, or empire. For millions, the most powerful reason to journey was faith. Sacred sites, holy rivers, and distant shrines drew pilgrims across continents, often at great personal cost, in search of healing, enlightenment, or divine favor. These were not mere vacations. They were spiritual tests, acts of devotion in motion. In ancient India, pilgrimage was central to Hindu and Buddhist life. People traveled to bathe in the sacred Ganges, visit shrines like Varanasi or Bodh Gaya, or climb high into the Himalayas to seek out mountain hermitages. These journeys, often long and perilous, were believed to wash away karma and bring one closer to liberation. Buddhist monks journeyed not just within India, but beyond, spreading their faith along trade routes into Sri Lanka, Central Asia, China, and beyond. In Greece, pilgrims flocked to oracles like Delphi, where the priestess of Apollo spoke in riddles believed to reveal divine insight. Others visited healing sanctuaries like Epidaurus, where offerings and rituals were performed in hopes of curing ailments. These sacred journeys doubled as social and economic events, with vendors, entertainers, and civic ceremonies making pilgrimages to community affairs. In the Roman Empire, religion was interwoven with state identity. Pilgrimages to temples and imperial cult centers were both acts of piety and political loyalty. Devotees might travel to the Temple of Asclepius for healing or make the trek to Jerusalem, then under Roman control as part of Jewish religious tradition, especially during festivals like Passover. Pilgrimage was also a cornerstone of Zoroastrian and Egyptian traditions. Ancient Persians traveled to fire temples, while Egyptians made sacred journeys along the Nile to participate in temple festivals such as those at Abydos, believed to be the burial place of Osiris. These sacred travels often blurred the lines between spiritual and political space. Roads were maintained not just for armies or merchants, but for the faithful. Shrines emerged along trade routes, and temples doubled as inns for pilgrims as a result. Pilgrimage helped knit together vast regions with shared belief systems and sacred geographies. Ultimately, these journeys were more than physical. To travel in devotion was to symbolically leave behind one's ego, comforts, and attachments, and return transformed. The body moved across the land, but the soul journeyed far deeper. By the time the ancient world gave way to the medieval era, the foundations of global connectivity had already been laid, not by emperors alone, but by the countless travelers who braved the unknown. Merchants, pilgrims, explorers, and scholars had woven together a vast web of routes, overland and maritime, sacred and commercial, peaceful and perilous. What they left behind was not just footprints, but a legacy of exchange of goods, ideas, faiths, and technologies that would shape civilizations for centuries. Travel changed everything. The spread of writing systems like the Phoenician alphabet helped standardize communication across borders. Religious movements, Buddhism, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and later Islam, all owe their global reach to the steady footsteps of wandering teachers and believers. Spices from India flavored Roman feasts. Chinese silk adorned Parthian kings. African gold crossed the Red Sea and ended up in Persian treasuries. But travel also reshaped how people thought about the world. Ancient geographers like Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy, using little more than sun angles and logic. Strabo and Ptolemy mapped continents using second-hand reports and daring assumptions. Even inaccurate maps were steps towards something larger, a vision of a connected Earth where distant people were no longer myth, but fellow humans on different roads. These roads, rivers, and sea lanes would eventually evolve into the great trade networks of the medieval and early modern worlds. The Silk Road would merge into Islamic caravan routes. Roman roads would be walked by Christian pilgrims. Indian Ocean sailing knowledge would be inherited by Arab, Chinese, and eventually European navigators. Perhaps most remarkably, the spirit of ancient travel. This urge to reach out beyond the known endures. The modern world may be powered by engines and GPS, but its heart still beats with the same curiosity that drove Phoenician sailors, Chinese caravanners, and Egyptian emissaries thousands of years ago. They didn't have passports, credit cards, or travel insurance, but they had boldness and vision and an unshakable belief that the world beyond the mountains, the dunes, or the waves mattered. That what lay beyond the horizon was worth the risk. And because they believed that we inherited a world tied together, not just by trade or conquest, but by human movement itself. In medieval Europe, your mental health, your moods, your energy, your thoughts, your tendency to cry over burnt porridge was believed to be controlled by a stew of internal fluids. These weren't metaphorical. They were literal bodily juices. And yes, someone somewhere probably tried to measure them. This ancient system came courtesy of the Greeks, specifically Hippocrates and Galen, and it stuck around for centuries longer than it had any right to. The theory of the four humors claimed your health, personality, and mood are all controlled by the balance of blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Each fluid was tied to a personality type. Too much blood. You were cheerful and energetic until you got annoying and they bled you with leeches. Excess yellow bile made you angry and impulsive. Great for battle, bad for dinner parties. Black bile was associated with melancholy, what we now call depression. But back then there was a mood imbalance caused by cold and dry conditions and too much sitting around thinking and phlegm. That was for the slow, the calm. But maybe he's just tired. So if you were sad, you didn't need therapy. You needed a bucket and a guy with a knife. The preferred cure for emotional distress was bloodletting, a fun little procedure where someone opened a vein and hoped it made you feel better before you passed out. If that didn't work, you might be prescribed laxatives, because obviously when your soul hurts, it's your bowels physicians. And we're using that word generously here. We'll diagnose you by asking probing questions like, do you feel moist or dry today? They might examine your urine, consult the stars, or smell your breath. The conclusion? Always the humor. You are either too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry, or simply too difficult to treat without divine intervention. It's worth remembering that these weren't fringe beliefs. This was mainstream medicine for centuries. So when you imagine a medieval person having a panic attack, don't picture a concerned friend offering tea. Picture a man with a robe, a chart of fluids, and a very sharp knife saying, let's drain the sand out. In medieval Europe, if you felt off emotionally, mentally, spiritually, and couldn't blame it on sin, demons, or your neighbor's weird bread, there was another obvious culprit, the moon, yes. That bright, glowing orb in the sky was believed to have direct influence over your mental state. The term lunatic didn't come out of nowhere. It comes from luna, the Latin word for moon, and people genuinely believed that too much exposure to moonlight could scramble your brain like an undercooked egg. This wasn't just folk belief either. It was widely accepted by doctors, clergy, philosophers, and that guy yelling near the well. The idea was that the moon, being a celestial body with feelings, could mess with your bodily fluids, especially your brain fluids, which were assumed to slosh around your skull like sad soup whenever the full moon hit just right. People who acted strangely around the time of a full moon weren't considered stressed, overwhelmed, or neurodivergent. They were just moonstruck. Some were even locked away temporarily until the lunar cycle passed, which was medieval healthcare's version of wait out. The moon also got the blame for epilepsy, insomnia, hallucinations, and basically anything you couldn't easily treat with soup, leeches, or prayer. If you were up at night pacing or crying, they wouldn't ask about your childhood. They'd ask about the sky. Even animals weren't safe. Farmers swore that sheep acted skittish and dogs howled differently under a full moon. And if your ox kicked over a cart or your pig ran off into the woods, someone was bound to mutter the moon's up to something. Of course, there was no science to back any of this up, but in fairness, there also wasn't science. Most medical texts reference astrology as casually as we reference caffeine, and treatments often included not just herbs and diet changes, but planetary alignments. Because sometimes it wasn't madness, it was just bad moon energy. If your mental health took a turn, say you started weeping into your bread, shouting at trees, or speaking in rhyming couplets, the first person to consult wasn't a doctor, it was the local priest. Why? Because in the Middle Ages, the mind was considered a spiritual battlefield, and any behavior outside the norm was immediately interpreted through a theological lens. Depression. Maybe you'd committed a sin and forgotten anxiety. A sure sign the devil was getting cozy in your soul. Hearing voices. Classic demonic Airbnb situation. Priests were essentially the default mental health professionals. Except instead of therapy, they offered confession, fasting, and a stern reminder that you were made of dust and should probably act like it. If you showed signs of what we now call a mental illness, the priest would perform a moral diagnosis. Were you skipping church? Coveting thy neighbor's wife? Laughing too much? Yes, that was suspicious. If so, your condition might not require herbs. It might require repentance. For more extreme cases like hallucinations, mutism, or erratic behavior, the church had more robust tools. These included prayer vigils, pilgrimages, and, in special cases, minor exorcisms. Just to make sure your sadness wasn't a demon in disguise. Can't be too careful. Even routine emotions were under suspicion. Excessive joy could be seen as vanity, deep sadness, sloth of the soul, also known as aesthesia, which was basically spiritual depression treated with psalms and guilt. If you were melancholic, you weren't in need of support. You were morally slippery and possibly just not trying hard enough. The irony? Many people genuinely found comfort in the church's explanations. In a world without neuroscience, the idea that suffering had cosmic meaning was oddly reassuring. It gave structure to chaos, even if the treatment was a bit chant-heavy. Still, if you had a mental health issue in the Middle Ages, your best hope wasn't compassion. He was a priest with a decent bedside manner and a low threshold for demon accusations. So you've been hearing voices, having visions, or just talking to your soup too fondly. In today's world, you might get therapy, or at least a wellness podcast recommendation. In the Middle Ages, you got an exorcism. Yes, the preferred treatment for many mental disturbances was not medication or rest, but a firm and theatrical spiritual eviction. The logic was simple. If you were acting weird, it probably wasn't stress or trauma. It was Beelzebub making himself at home behind your eyeballs, and he wasn't paying rent. Exorcisms came in two varieties, the minor kind, which was basically an intense prayer circle with holy water and muttering, and the major kind, which was more of a live performance with a cast of one very nervous patient, one heavily robed priest, and a backup choir of concerned monks humming in Latin. The rituals varied, but the essentials remained consistent: chanting, reading scripture, signs of the cross, relics, and occasionally yelling things like, "Depart foul spirit," directly into your face. If you happened to flinch, that was seen as evidence it was working. If you didn't flinch, they just chanted louder. Some records describe afflicted people being tied down, sprinkled with salt, or forced to drink holy water. Others were made to fast for days beforehand, which, to be fair, could drive anyone to strange behavior. One unfortunate soul reportedly had demons smoked out of his ears using burning sage, frankincense, and what we assume was a deep misunderstanding of ventilation. And if none of that worked, you were either deemed beyond help or tragically misdiagnosed as simply being naturally wicked. Not all exorcisms were terrifying, though. In many villages, there were communal events where people gathered in the town square to witness a good old-fashioned supernatural showdown. Think of it as medieval spiritual theater, part religious ritual, part entertainment, part neighborhood gossip starter. But in truth, most people who underwent exorcisms weren't evil. They were just overwhelmed, traumatized, neurodivergent, or unlucky enough to have a panic attack near a bishop. Let's say you weren't quite disturbed enough for an exorcism, but still deeply troubling at dinner. You wept for no reason, forgot your own name on occasion, or spent a bit too long staring at firewood philosophically. In this case, your treatment wouldn't involve ropes or shouting, just a lot of praying, possibly while being locked in a room. This was known in some circles as the gentle approach to mental health. You'd be told that your condition was spiritual in origin and could be overcome through self-reflection, discipline, and of course, relentless repentance. Essentially, medieval mental health care boiled down to, have you tried feeling bad about it? The logic was that suffering purified the soul, so if you were already suffering mentally, clearly you were halfway there. Monks and nuns, some genuinely compassionate, others just chronically overworked, might guide you through periods of meditative silence, prayer vigils, fasting, and sleeping on uncomfortable surfaces until either the devil left, where you forgot what happiness felt like. Some people voluntarily entered monasteries as a kind of medieval retreat center. These weren't quite spas, more like spiritual timeout chambers. You got a cell, a Bible, and 8 hours of daily chanting. Occasionally you'd also get stew. Whether this helped mental illness or simply masked it with religious exhaustion is still debated. And then there were the relics feeling unwell. Touch the bone fragment of ST. Trouble sleeping. Sleep near a vial of martyr's blood. Sad for no reason. That's what the toe of ST. Euphemia is for. The idea was that holiness was contagious, like kindness or fleas. Now, to be fair, this was the closest thing to compassionate care in many places. Unlike exorcisms or beatings, a prayer-based route didn't usually involve injury. Just lots of chanting and being told your thoughts were problematic. Sometimes monks genuinely helped people through community, quietude, and structure routine. Other times they just told you to fast and hope for divine clarity by sunrise. Let's say your condition went beyond moody sighs and occasional candle staring. Maybe you'd started wandering barefoot through town, mumbling about angels or loudly debating theology with barn animals. At that point, the medieval response wasn't a support group. It was a stone room with one window and no doorknob on your side. Enter the monastic cell, or as some historians delicately put it, protective isolation. These cells were tucked inside monasteries or churches and were considered a form of mercy. Emphasis on consideration. You wouldn't be chained or tortured, hopefully, but you would be firmly encouraged not to leave. Sometimes for years, the space was simple. Bare walls, maybe a straw mat, and if you were lucky, a little window through which food, mostly cold gruel, would arrive twice a day. Human contact was rare because the working theory was that your madness was contagious, emotionally, spiritually, or atmospherically. You weren't entirely forgotten, though. Monks might offer prayers for your soul. Occasionally, a kindly brother might bring herbs or read psalms outside your door in a tone that suggested you weren't the worst thing they'd seen that week. Sometimes the locked room was not part of a monastery, but an actual public institution, the early versions of asylums. These weren't common until much later, but a few existed in medieval Islamic cities and by the 13th century in places like London and Paris. The goal? Shelter, not treatment, and certainly not recovery. Now, to their credit, the medieval mindset wasn't always cruel. Many believed the mentally unwell were closer to the divine, touched by God, or perhaps walking that fine line between prophecy and peculiar behavior. But practically speaking, locking someone away for their own good was just easier than figuring out what to do with them. Families often begged monasteries to take in afflicted relatives, promising donations in return. The alternative was trying to explain to the neighbors why Uncle Thaddeus was shouting Latin in Cabbage Patch again. If you were a woman in medieval Europe and found yourself overwhelmed, irritable, or tearful, perhaps after your 11th child or your third husband with plague breath, congratulations, you were probably diagnosed with hysteria. Now, diagnosed is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. Hysteria wasn't so much a diagnosis, as it was a blanket explanation for this woman is behaving in a way that makes men uncomfortable. Crying too much? Hysteria. Not crying enough? Suspicious. Possibly a witch. Expressing opinions, ambition, or fatigue. Definitely a uterus problem. The term itself comes from the Greek hysteria, meaning womb. The theory, embrace yourself, was that a woman's uterus could become unmoored and wander freely about the body, causing trouble wherever it went. Yes, that's right. A robed floating womb was blamed for everything from anxiety to chronic sighing. Somewhere in your abdomen, your uterus was just doing laps and ruining your day. Symptoms of hysteria included shortness of breath, nervousness, fainting, emotional outbursts, and to quote one actual medieval source, too much thought. Truly a devastating condition. Treatments varied. A priest might recommend fasting, prayer. A physician might apply herbs, and in some cases rather awkward manual stimulation was prescribed to calm the uterus, performed by midwives or in later centuries by early gynecologists with concerning lack of supervision. Marriage was also considered a cure. If a woman was single, she needed a husband to settle her wound. If she was married, then obviously she just needed to be pregnant again. Either way, her mental health was treated with more chores and less rest. And if she kept acting strangely, seeing visions, resisting housework, or having too many thoughts in Latin, things could escalate. Some women were accused of witchcraft because nothing screams mental illness, like growing herbs and asking questions. But not all was bleak in some cases. Women found support from convents where the demands of daily life were lighter and emotional distress was seen as part of spiritual struggle. Some nuns even wrote about their anguish in ways that sound suspiciously modern, minus the demon metaphors. Still, if you were a woman in the Middle Ages with feelings, your best mental health strategy was simple. Keep it quiet, keep it short, and never ever talk to your cat in public. In a time when monks prescribed fasting, priests blamed demons and physicians swore by bleeding your soul out through your ankle. The real MVPs of medieval mental health were the herbalists, often elderly women with gardens, cats, and suspiciously good intuition. These wise women, sometimes called cunning folk, were the unofficial, unlicensed therapists of their day. They didn't ask how your humors were feeling. They asked when it started, how you were sleeping, and whether your mother-in-law was bothering you again. Their methods were simple. Tea, tinctures, and talking, though the talking part was often disguised as advice about herbs. You'd sit in a smoky cottage surrounded by drying plants, and before long you'd be sipping something made of valerian root and lavender while ranting about your neighbor's pig. It was like therapy, but it also cured warts. Herbalists treated sadness with calming infusions. Anxiety was soothed with chamomile and balm. If you were really distraught, you might get mugwort as tea, John's wort, or in desperate cases, a stiff dose of poppy extract. They called it a sleep aid. You'd call it accidental time travel. Most of these women weren't formally educated, but their remedies were rooted in generational knowledge, observation, and something modern medicine likes to call actually listening to the patient, which unfortunately also made them suspicious to everyone else. The church viewed them as threats. After all, they operated outside the religious system, didn't quote scripture, and didn't insist every problem came from sin. Some towns quietly appreciated them. Others accused them of witchcraft if they got too popular, too effective, or too confident in public. Still, they were often the only source of comfort for people suffering from what we'd now call depression, trauma, or plain old burnout. If you were lucky, your village herbalist knew how to blend calming herbs, light a protective candle, and tell you that no, you weren't cursed. You were just tired and underappreciated. Were their treatments perfect? Of course not. Sometimes they rub onions on your feet. But compared to being locked in a stone room or yelled at by a monk holding a goat's skull, the herbalist approach was practically holistic luxury. So far, we've covered prayers, isolation, and a charming herbalist with an herbalist license issued by no one. But medieval mental health had one more tier of solutions, the truly imaginative ones, the kind that made you wonder if the physician was just winging it based on dreams and pantry contents. Let's begin with the dead owl treatment. Yes, if you were plagued by sadness or excessive thoughts, one popular remedy was to tie a dead owl to your head. It was believed the owl, a symbol of wisdom, would absorb the confusion or melancholy through your scalp. In practice, it mostly absorbed flies. Feeling particularly anxious? Try powdered emeralds. That's right, jewel dust. Physicians recommended grinding actual gemstones and rubbing the sparkly remains on your chest or consuming tiny amounts. Not only did it not work, it was a great way to ruin both your digestive tract and your jewelry collection. Then there were the cures involving astrology, which were less medical and more vibe check from the stars. A patient's mental disturbance might be blamed on Mars being in a bad mood. Treatment: wait until Jupiter looks friendlier. One medieval medical manual suggested wrapping the sufferer in wolf skin during a thunderstorm to scare off the madness. Another recommended whispering into the left ear of a black dog and then letting it run away with your sorrow like a very sad, very hairy therapy courier. You could also find remedies involving smoked herbs stuffed into pigeons, which were then waved near your head. No one's quite sure what this was supposed to do, but it was very aromatic and quite annoying to the pigeon. And if none of that worked, there was always pilgrimage, the all-purpose medieval solution to everything. Pack your sandals, grab a staff, and walk hundreds of miles to a holy site. With any luck, you'd either find spiritual peace, or at least get enough blisters to distract from your emotional state. These oddball cures remind us that medieval medicine wasn't entirely malicious, just wildly misinformed, often experimental, and occasionally bird-based. And hey, if nothing else, they gave people hope, which in those days was about as close to Prozac as it got. Every medieval town, big or small, seemed to have that guy. You know, the one dressed oddly, muttering to himself, sometimes blessing chickens, sometimes cursing puddles, the town madman. And strangely enough, society didn't always lock him away or call for holy water. They just let him be. In an age when mental health was misunderstood at best and feared at worst, this was oddly progressive. People with visible mental illness weren't always banished. They were often absorbed into daily life, tolerated like unpredictable weather or that one goat who thinks he owns the street. The madman or madwoman, though women were sadly more likely to be accused of witchcraft, held a peculiar place in the medieval social order. Not quite a threat, not quite a joke, and occasionally revered. In some towns, these individuals were even seen as touched by God or given a grudging respect for their unpredictability. If they spouted cryptic phrases while staring into the sun, people assumed it was divine prophecy or just Wednesday. They were usually given a nickname, Old Will the Wanderer, Mad Meg Tomfool. You'll notice these sound suspiciously like pub names, which says a lot about how much people drank while pondering madness. These individuals often lived on the fringes, sleeping in abandoned mills, church porches, or literal barrels, Diogenes style. Townsfolk would sometimes give them food or shoes or just a wide berth. Children were told not to stare, which of course meant they stared constantly. Occasionally, their strange behavior would lead to small acts of charity. A baker might leave out crusts. A blacksmith might repair a bent walking stick. Medieval communities, for all their superstition, could be surprisingly compassionate, especially when guilt and the fear of eternal damnation were good motivators. But if the madman's behavior got too loud, too violent, or too unsettling, patience ran out. Then came the priest, the isolation, or worse. Tolerance had limits, especially if the afflicted stopped being amusing and started being inconvenient. In modern times, we understand that depression is a complex condition involving brain chemistry, life circumstances, and sometimes just terrible Mondays. But in the Middle Ages, if you were feeling persistently low, tired, or like life was a slow-motion mudslide, congratulations. You were guilty of aesthesia. Aesthesia wasn't seen as a mental health issue. It was classified as a spiritual failure, one of the original deadly sins before sloth eventually stole its thunder and got top billing. Aesthesia was sadness at divine good, or in more practical terms, spiritual apathy, lack of joy, and the general medieval version of lying in bed staring at the ceiling. Monks were especially prone to this condition, which they poetically called the noonday demon. Picture it as a monk supposed to be copying psalms, staring at a wall, wondering what the point of it all is. In today's world, that's called burnout. In the 12th century, it was a moral crisis requiring urgent rebuke and possibly more prayer beads. Sufferers of Acadia weren't offered comfort. They were told to pray harder, work more, and stop being selfish. Depression wasn't a condition. It was laziness with branding. If your soul didn't feel joy, it was your fault. Maybe you hadn't repented hard enough. Maybe you were secretly proud. Maybe, and this was the nuclear option, you were letting Satan win. And if you dared to express your sorrow out loud, you weren't just pitted. You were viewed as contagious. Sadness could spread. It was like an emotional mildew. And monasteries didn't want it soaking into the walls. Lay people weren't immune either. If you couldn't find joy in your toil, it wasn't because you were exhausted or grieving. It was a sign that you needed to go to confession and maybe build a shed out of guilt. Ironically, some writings from monks who battled Acidia sound remarkably modern descriptions of numbness, fatigue, restlessness, even suicidal thoughts. But instead of therapy, they prescribed fasting and mentally cataloging your sins in alphabetical order. In a time when most people owned 2 shirts and one of them was infested with fleas, you think laughter would be encouraged. A little joy, perhaps? A chuckle to get through the plague-filled, mud-splattered, leech-happy nightmare that was daily life. Think again. In medieval Europe, laughter wasn't always a sign of happiness. It was often considered a moral red flag. Sure, peasants laughed. Jesters laughed. Occasionally, even monks cracked a smile if a goose did something particularly scandalous. But the official stance from theologians, chroniclers, and very serious people was that laughter could be dangerous, the gateway emotion to chaos, sin, and possibly dancing. The Church, ever watchful of human weakness, warned against excessive mirth. Thomas Aquinas, whose sense of humor was reportedly filed under to be developed, believed that laughter should be moderate and serve a higher purpose. Uncontrolled laughter, a sign of spiritual disorder, maybe even demonic influence. After all, who laughs without reason? Answer: people with a functioning sense of humor. Women, of course, were doubly judged. A laughing woman was clearly up to something. Witchcraft, probably, while a solemn, silent woman was appropriately pious, or just very dehydrated. And let's not forget the laughter of the mad. If someone laughed at inappropriate times, say during a funeral or while milking a goat, it wasn't seen as eccentric. It was seen as evidence of mental illness, possession, or both. Involuntary giggling was basically a red flag with a tambourine. In some religious orders, novices were explicitly forbidden to laugh during meals, prayer, or basically any activity that might spark human connection. Joy was fine in theory, but it had to be the wholly inward kind, not the belly-aching, wine-snorting kind you get after someone slips on a turnip. Still, people did laugh. Humor survived in village festivals, in satirical poetry, and in that one guy in every town who made funny noises with his armpits. But it was always a little risky. Joy was tolerated, but not trusted. In today's world, talking to your cat is quirky. In the Middle Ages, it was potentially heretical, mildly alarming, and depending on the tone of your voice, grounds for questioning your sanity or scheduling a light exorcism. You see, medieval society had very clear ideas about who you could and could not have conversations with. People were fine, priests better. But if you started chatting with animals, invisible angels, or anything that didn't answer back out loud, eyebrows were raised, usually followed by torches. Let's start with animals. Cats were already walking a fine line. On one hand, they controlled pests. On the other, they were sleek, mysterious, and never went to church. If you confided in your tabby too often, people might assume she was your familiar. Sent by the devil to whisper forbidden wisdom about herbal remedies and where your neighbor hid his cheese. Birds were also suspect. Medieval bestiaries were full of half-true and fully weird facts. If someone said a crow told them the future that wasn't poetic, that was treason against sanity. Even dogs, mankind's loyal companions, were acceptable until they started appearing in your dreams wearing robes and quoting scripture. Then there were the angels, who, according to countless religious texts, were everywhere, watching, protecting, and occasionally delivering ominous messages during thunderstorms. If you claimed to see or hear them often, you might be considered saintly, or if your timing was poor, mad, or possessed. The difference often depended on whether you were in a monastery or yelling at clouds in the town square. And of course, imaginary friends. Children got a pass mostly. But adults? If you claim to be speaking with invisible beings who gave you instructions, the options are limited. Prophet, lunatic, or future bonfire decoration. There wasn't much middle ground. Interestingly, some mystics, like Hildegard of Bingen, claimed vivid visions and conversations with divine figures, and because they were cloistered, educated, and slightly intimidating, they were tolerated. But if you were a peasant named Bertram who talked to squirrels about theology, you probably weren't writing illuminated manuscripts anytime soon. In the medieval world, mental illness teetered between two extremes. Either you were a walking curiosity or a shameful family secret, and often both, depending on whether the village market was open. Let's start with public spectacle. If someone with visible mental illness wandered through town, muttering, dancing in the rain, or arguing passionately with a bucket, they might attract attention, not scorn. In fact, they could become a fixture of village life, like the bell tower or that one goat that always escaped. People would watch, whisper, maybe even laugh, not out of cruelty. Well, not always, but out of a weird blend of amusement and fear, because deep down, everyone was worried. That could be me next week if I get hit on the head or eat spoiled eel pie. In some places, these individuals were known as natural fools, a term that sounded insulting, but was weirdly affectionate by medieval standards. They were seen as innocent, almost childlike, and sometimes believed to have been touched by God, fate, or just a very unfortunate moon phase. You could end up with food, shelter, and a nickname. It wasn't ideal, but in a world without therapy, it beat being locked in a tower. But for families, it's not so charming. If your relative was quietly struggling, maybe depressed, withdrawn, or plagued by what we'd now call anxiety, it was often handled as a private matter, which in medieval terms meant don't talk about it. Ever. Shame was a powerful social currency, and troubled mind in the household could reflect poorly on the whole lineage. Some families kept afflicted members hidden. Others sent them to monasteries or pilgrimage routes, hoping divine geography would work where herbal tea had failed. In some sadder cases, people were disowned entirely, especially if they were seen as disruptive or, worst of all, embarrassing at weddings. Public mental health care barely existed. Shame filled the gap where support systems should have been no clinics. No community outreach, just a mix of whispered prayers and pretending everything was fine. By the end of the Middle Ages, somewhere around the late 15th century, give or take a plague, things started to shift. Not quickly, not gracefully. But if you squinted hard enough, you could spot the early signs of humanity inching toward compassion, one confused scholar at a time. For one, philosophy and science began to sneak into the conversation. Thanks to Arabic medical texts preserved and translated in places like Spain and Sicily, Western Europe was reintroduced to ancient Greek thinkers who, while not exactly modern psychologists, had at least considered that the human mind wasn't just a demonic puppet show. Scholars started to flirt with the idea that madness could stem from imbalances in the body, not just sins or sorcery. Physicians began to write treatises discussing melancholy and mania, with slightly fewer biblical quotes and slightly more anatomy. Don't get excited. Treatments still involve things like applying leech to the temple, but at least people were reading. At the same time, the idea of charitable care began to evolve. In cities like Valencia and Cairo, early hospitals started to separate out patients with mental disturbances from general wards. Some even offered gardens, music, and gas conversation. It was still far from dignified, but better than being yelled at by a priest while tied to a goat post. The printing press didn't hurt either. With more access to books, ideas about the mind began to spread faster than syphilis at a midsummer fair. This helped plant the seeds for the Renaissance, when mental illness began its long uphill climb from your curse to you might need support. Of course, not everything changed. People still feared what they didn't understand, and the line between madness and mysticism remained as thin as a monk's bedsheet. But the groundwork was laid. Slowly, the mad were no longer seen solely as vessels of sin or divine wrath. They were, in a radical twist, beginning to be seen as human, fallible, suffering, and worthy of care. Not hugs, though. That would come centuries later. From the outside, noble life looked divine. Perfumed corridors, diamond-crusted attire, servants waiting on every whim. Whether at Versailles or within the imperial walls of Kyoto, nobility projected an illusion of perfection, elegance frozen in time like a portrait. But what the public didn't see was the suffocating reality beneath the powdered faces and rigid etiquette. For many nobles, this life of luxury was less like heaven and more like a velvet-lined prison. Every aspect of a noble's day, from when to rise to how to fold a napkin, was dictated by unwritten rules or ceremonial codes. In France, nobles were expected to perform the liver ritual each morning, where courtiers would literally line up to watch the king get out of bed. Participation wasn't optional. If you weren't seen in the right rooms at the right hours, rumors spread, your influence shrank, your enemies smiled, and at Versailles, losing social capital was often deadlier than losing money across the world. In Japan, court nobles in Kyoto faced a different but equally suffocating script. The Heian elite were expected to master poetry, calligraphy, music, and the subtle art of aloof expression. Every word, every bow, every sleeve movement was political theater, and failure to perform correctly social suicide. Even leisure was performative. A ball wasn't just a party. It was a test of alliances. A walk in the garden might be a silent battlefield of glances and veiled insults. You weren't simply living your life. You were playing a role in an eternal play where the audience was everyone, and the stakes were your legacy. And yet few nobles escaped because the very privileges that made them admired also kept them chained. Inheritance laws, arranged marriages, debt obligations, and the constant surveillance of rivals meant they rarely had control over their own fates. Behind the closed doors of their manor houses, many nobles experienced mental decline, quiet rebellion, or spiritual despair. But in public they smiled. Always smiled. This was the great paradox of noble life. The more prestige you had, the less freedom you possessed. They were born at the top, but often died without ever living for themselves. When you picture a nobleman striding through Versailles in silk stockings, For a lady gliding down a staircase in pearls, the last thing you imagine is debt collectors. But behind all the glamour, a surprising number of nobles were financially drowning. It turns out that maintaining the illusion of wealth was more expensive than actual wealth itself. At Versailles, appearances were everything. A noble might spend more on a new waistcoat or ball gown than on maintaining an entire estate. Why? Because fashion was currency. If you didn't keep up, you vanished politically, socially, and eventually financially. Courtiers would gamble enormous sums not just at cards, but on horses, land speculation, and high-stakes alliances. Many nobles mortgaged ancestral estates to fund one more season of social relevance, and the king didn't help. Louis XIV in particular kept nobles close, not just physically, but economically. He encouraged extravagant spending at court to keep them dependent, distracted, and loyal. A ruined noble was a controllable noble. In England, the aristocracy wasn't much better off during the Georgian era. Lords and ladies often lived in opulent townhouses in London, financed entirely on credit. Tailors, wine merchants, and milliners were expected to wait months, sometimes years, for payment. Entire families balanced on the edge of collapse, hoping their daughter would marry a wealthier man, or that some distant cousin would die and leave them a title and a working estate. Meanwhile, in Russia, nobles were granted vast lands populated by serfs, and yet many were still cash poor. The wealth was illiquid. Lavish lifestyles in Moscow required constant borrowing. Pawn shops discreetly handled tiaras and sabers. Family jewels were sold under candlelight behind locked doors. Japan's noble class fared no better during periods of peace. As the samurai class shifted from warrior to bureaucrat during the Tokugawa era, many nobles found themselves ceremonial but irrelevant. Stipends shrank. Costs remained. Some took side jobs. Yes, actual jobs in poetry schools or estate management to keep up appearances. But admitting financial hardship was dishonor, so debts piled in secret. The lesson? Nobility wasn't about financial stability. It was about the performance of wealth. And often that performance came at a soul-crushing cost. Scandal was the unofficial second language of the nobility. Affairs, duels, secret children, whispered betrayals. The more polished the public image, the dirtier the private truths. Nobles had power, prestige, and privilege. But what many of them didn't have: restraint. In Versailles, courtiers lived in such close quarters that privacy was nearly non-existent, and yet illicit liaisons flourished. Queen Marie Antoinette was endlessly accused of romantic entanglements, whether with Swedish nobles or her inner circle of ladies. Many of these rumors were false, but they stuck because everyone knew someone who was doing exactly that. The court practically ran on gossip, and scandal wasn't just tolerated, it was currency. Your name in someone else's bedroom could either elevate your influence or ruin your bloodline. Meanwhile, over in England, aristocratic reputations were shredded in salons and gambling houses. Lord Byron, for example, was rumored to have fathered children with his half-sister. That didn't stop him from being a celebrity, but cast a long shadow over his noble status. Nobles were expected to have mistresses, just not too many. Definitely not the wrong ones. Affairs with actresses, commoners, or foreign spies that could lead to exile, imprisonment, or, in rare cases, an early grave. In Imperial Russia, the court of Catherine the Great was notorious for its openness. The empress herself had lovers throughout her reign, often handpicked and elevated to positions of power. But it wasn't just Catherine. Her courtiers were constantly engaged in intrigues, often mixing political maneuvering with bedroom games. Affairs were less about love and more about leverage. Even in the refined Heian court of Japan, where restraint and poetry reigned, scandal found its way through haiku and love letters. A noblewoman might receive a midnight visitor whose identity she would never reveal, but her next poem, shared among the elite, might offer just enough metaphor to ignite a wildfire of speculation. The most dangerous scandals, though, were the ones that never made it into letters or court whispers. The ones involving treason, espionage, and betrayal of blood. These were whispering corridors, documented in coded correspondence, and buried in family archives. Because in noble life, scandal wasn't the exception, it was the wallpaper. beautiful, intricate, and always hiding cracks underneath. For all their earthly power and luxury, nobles were often tormented by a far less visible force, the crushing weight of spiritual uncertainty. They had everything, yet still wrestled with existential dread. Being born into privilege didn't grant clarity about the afterlife, morality, or divine purpose. In fact, it often made things worse. In Catholic France, guilt clung to the corridors of palaces like smoke. The same nobles who attended Mass daily might also indulge in debauchery. Every night, confession was routine, but more for social performance than true penitence. Still, many nobles, especially as they aged, were haunted by their sins. Some turned toward mystics and visionaries, desperate for answers. Even Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, grew more devout in his final years, racked with fear over his worldly indulgences and the wars he'd waged across Europe. Nobles funded churches and monasteries not just out of piety, but insurance. In their minds, a new chapel might buy them a cleaner conscience. 1,000 candles lit in their name could offset a life of intrigue and excess. Some retreated into monastic life altogether in old age, swapping velvet robes for hair shirts. In Orthodox Russia, things were more intense. Nobles were expected to uphold both political and spiritual order. Yet many wrestled with doubt, especially during the turbulent reigns of czars who declared themselves chosen by God, even as they ordered purges. Some nobles sought answers in secret prayer circles, or turned to fools for Christ, holy wanderers who renounced wealth and comfort to speak uncomfortable truths. These odd mystics sometimes served as the only outlet for aristocrats facing spiritual crises. Meanwhile, in feudal Japan, the samurai nobility hybrid class often found themselves torn between Confucian ethics, Shinto rituals, and Buddhist detachment. Some nobles turned to Zen, hoping meditation would silence their inner turmoil. Others composed poetry not just for art's sake, but as spiritual catharsis. Still, the tension between duty, honor, and the impermanence of life gnawed at them when a noble committed seppuku. It wasn't always about shame. Sometimes it was about spiritual release. Despite their silks and titles, nobles were often profoundly lost. Surrounded by ritual and grandeur, many still stared into the void, wondering if any of it truly mattered. Behind the masks of status, their souls were whispering and sometimes screaming for peace in the age before smartphones and email. The most dangerous thing a noble could send wasn't an assassin. It was a letter. Ink on parchment could undo a dynasty, expose an affair, or spark a revolution. And nobles, despite their outward elegance, were compulsive correspondents. They wrote everything down. Secrets, longings, schemes, prayers, love, lies. These weren't idle pen pal exchanges. They were calculated tools of diplomacy and survival. At Versailles, every noble had a paper trail. Love letters to mistresses, pleas to creditors, carefully worded flatteries to the king, and not all of it was above board. Couriers carried sealed notes laced with invisible ink or written in cipher. A wrong phrase in the wrong hands could lead to exile or the scaffold. Some nobles even had personal ciphers, alphabets invented solely for clandestine conversations. The Duke of Orleans, for instance, was known to correspond with suspected radicals during the lead-up to the French Revolution, and his letters were meticulously coded. But ciphers were never foolproof. In one legendary case, a noble's encrypted diary was decoded long after his death, revealing a hidden life of treason and betrayal in the Habsburg courts. Marriage negotiations often played out through veiled language. A letter might begin with discussion of weather and falconry, but hide deeper intentions between the lines. Parents arranged matches through polite lies. Lovers begged for elopement under the guise of visiting countryside estates. In Japan's Heian era, poetry served as code. A single waka, just 31 syllables, could convey forbidden love, rejection, or a secret rendezvous. Noble women were particularly skilled at crafting double-meaning verses, often responding in kind within hours. These exchanges were delivered by discreet messengers, sometimes servants, sometimes children, always sworn to silence. During the Renaissance, some noble women ran entire espionage networks through their salons, writing to allies in foreign courts in Russia. Letters smuggled out of the Tsar's inner circle helped fuel uprisings. Nobles trapped in gilded cages turned to correspondence as their only form of rebellion. Paper became a weapon, shield, and confession booth all in one. Of course, the riskiest letters were the ones that never arrived, intercepted, burned, buried. Some lay hidden in attics and wall crevices for centuries, their secrets unread, their cinders long forgotten. But make no mistake, within those ink-stained lines lived revolutions, heartbreak, and the rawest truths of the noble soul. In noble society, emotion was a luxury no one could afford. Joy, anger, fear, all were carefully measured, rationed, or concealed entirely. A noble's survival depended not just on wealth or title, but on mastering the art of emotional camouflage. To rule at court, one had to perform and never ever flinch. At Versailles, life was a never-ending theater. Nobles rehearsed their smiles, their bows, their silences. A raised eyebrow could signal support or sabotage. Tears were reserved for funerals, and even then, only if the cameras of courtly judgment were watching. The goal was simple. Project Elegance. Hide the chaos. Those who failed were branded unstable, hysterical, or worse, unfit. This emotional choreography was learned young. Noble children were taught to speak only when spoken to display pride without arrogance, and to suppress grief until it could be written about in private diaries. Meltdowns were not just embarrassing. They were politically dangerous. A single outburst could be remembered for decades and used as ammunition in future rivalries. In Japan's Heian court, nobles were even more refined in their restraint. Public emotion was seen as vulgar. One's true feelings were shared only through metaphor in poetry, gestures, or carefully chosen silences. A noblewoman's sleeve might carry more meaning than her words. A fan opened halfway could signal heartbreak. A single cherry blossom plucked too early. Despair. To survive, one had to master subtlety as fluently as language. In England, nobles kept a stiff upper lip. A scandal could be quietly swallowed with a brandy, but never spoken of. Behind closed doors, journals wept for them. Volumes of sorrow and suppressed rage bound in leather and sealed away in desk drawers. Mental illness, grief, shame. All of it was hidden behind ballroom smiles and military posture. Some cracked under the pressure. There are records of nobles who snapped mid-dance or collapsed during ceremonies, later confined to asylums or sent away to recuperate in remote estates. But these were whispered tragedies. The show, after all, had to go on, because in the grand masquerade of nobility, emotions were a liability. Masks weren't just for balls, they were daily attire. And behind every bow, every compliment, every elegant laugh, there was often a storm raging, perfectly concealed behind silk and etiquette. To be born noble was to inherit not just land and titles, but expectations so heavy they could crush the spirit. From the first breath, a noble child was less a person and more a vessel for legacy. Every decision they made was haunted by the demands of their ancestors and the judgment of generations yet unborn. In France, sons of dukes and counts were groomed like racehorses. Their futures were mapped out in ledges and family trees. Marry this heiress. Befriend that prince. Don't embarrass the bloodline. Their lives were a continuation of a strategy that had started long before they were born, and often one they had no power to alter. Even the women were pawns on the family chessboard. A duchess's value was often measured by the strength of her dowry and the purity of her lineage. England's aristocracy had similar burdens. Firstborn sons inherited the estate, the debt, the staff, and the responsibility of ensuring the family didn't fall into disgrace, or worse, trade. Those who failed were remembered not for their humanity, but for being the one who lost the manor. Meanwhile, younger sons without land or title were quietly funneled into the church or military, with little choice in the matter. In Russia, noble families carried their status like a ticking time bomb. One misstep, one disagreement with the wrong court faction, and everything could be seized. Land, serfs, even the family name could be revoked. Generations of effort wiped away with a signature. Japan's aristocracy was even more rigid. In Heian times, noble families competed for proximity to the emperor. Positions and influence were passed down, not through merit, but through lineage, a single disgrace. A failed marriage, unruly son, could undo centuries of prestige. The pressure to conform was immense, and individuality was often sacrificed on the altar of ancestral duty. And what of those who didn't want the title? Who didn't want to marry the stranger, rule the estate, or bear the name? Rebellion wasn't just difficult. It was unthinkable. Some tried. Most were crushed by the machinery of tradition. The burden of inheritance wasn't just a financial or political matter. It was psychological. A crown of thorns worn under a golden halo. To be noble meant to be chained to a legacy, whether you wanted it or not. Not all nobles followed the script beneath layers of etiquette and centuries of family pressure. Some cracked and others resisted. But rebellion among the nobility wasn't always dramatic. There were no peasant uprisings here. No flaming torches, just quiet, subversive acts tucked into corners of palaces, hidden behind locked doors or disguised as tradition. In Versailles, where conformity reigned supreme, rebellion took on strange forms. Some nobles chose not to attend the king's elaborate mourning ritual, a grave offense that signaled independence. Others dared to wear colors out of fashion or commission portraits that didn't flatter. A few scandalized their families by marrying for love, not alliance. These small gestures in the world of court politics were explosive. In England, some aristocrats defied expectations by turning to art and literature. Lord Byron didn't just write poetry. He lived a life that mocked every expectation of noble restraint. Cross-dressing, traveling with lovers, scorning parliament. His life was a rolling provocation. Less flamboyant nobles simply vanished to the countryside, retreating from London's social obligations. That alone could be interpreted as rebellion, a refusal to play the game. In Russia, quiet dissent took more dangerous forms. Some nobles supported revolutionary ideas under the radar, disguising radical philosophy salons as harmless poetry gatherings. Others helped serfs escape or gave them education. Treasonous acts under the Tsar's rule. These weren't loud revolutions, but quiet betrayals of a broken system. Japanese nobles had even subtler means of rebellion. A poorly timed poem, a gift with a hidden insult, refusing to shave one's head in mourning. All of these could be read as rejection of ritual. Some noble women resisted their arranged marriages by falling in love through poetry. Subtle, yet scandalous. Others withdrew into religious life, not out of piety, but protest. And then there were those who simply disappeared, nobles who faked illness to avoid court, who buried themselves in dusty libraries, pretending to be too engrossed in astronomy or botany to deal with courtly nonsense. Their retreat wasn't a weakness. It was defiance. These rebels rarely made history books, but their choices, however quiet, chipped away at the illusion of perfect obedience. Not all nobles followed the rules. Some whispered no, and that in their world was louder than any scream. For all the grandeur and posturing, nobility was obsessed with one thing above all: legacy. Not the kind you feel, the kind you can engrave, paint, parade, and pass down. Portraits in oil, family crests etched into marble, vast estates with names longer than some novels. Every ball, battle, and betrothal was part of an unending project to be remembered. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Most of them weren't. Yes, we remember the monarchs, the kings who launched wars, the queens who lost their heads. But the average noble, forgotten. Their elaborate rituals, their infighting, their expensive shoes vanished like breath on glass. What remains are fragments, and signed letters, crumbling estate walls, cryptic mentions in estate ledgers. The grand story of the aristocracy isn't one of eternal glory. It's one of selective survival. In France, the revolution didn't just end lives. It erased entire bloodlines from memory. Portraits were defaced. Names were banned. The aristocracy, who obsessed over how history would view them, were instead swept away by it. Some survived, sure, by changing names, hiding jewels in fireplace bricks, or fleeing to foreign courts. But their legacies were not what they had intended. They became cautionary tales, not immortals. England's nobles fared better, legally protected, land-rich, institutionally embedded. Yet even they were not immune to irrelevance. Once buzzing estates now sit in ruin. Dust covers tapestries that once cost fortunes. The great names dissolve through scandal, poor marriages, or just time. A line with no heirs is a legacy with no future. In Japan, the aristocracy was eventually replaced in importance by the military class, the samurai and shogunate. The elaborate poetry, the court rankings, the ceremonies faded, and though a few families traced their roots to ancient noble houses, the modern world rarely cares. Even the proudest names became museum labels. And what of those who tried to control the narrative? Commissioning epic biographies, dictating memoirs, sponsoring churches? They too are subject to history's selective memory. Often the real stories, the shame, the secrets, the compromises, survive only in whispers, footnotes, or hidden letters. In the end, legacy was the ultimate illusion. Nobles lived in service of being remembered, yet were often forgotten entirely. Behind the portraits and palaces lies a quiet truth. Permanence was never real. Only the performance was. In the spring of 1900, a curious man in a wide-brimmed hat stood under the Cretan sun, staring at scattered stones and half-buried walls. His name was Sir Arthur Evans, a British archaeologist, historian, and eccentric dreamer. He had come to Crete not just to excavate ruins, but to chase a ghost, specifically the ghost of a civilization that had haunted Greek legends for centuries. A civilization so old it slipped through the cracks of both history and myth. For years, travelers and locals had spoken of strange artifacts surfacing in the hills south of Heracleion. Pottery older than Mycenaean, strange glyphs no one could read, and ruins that didn't quite match any known Greek style. Evans was convinced that these were the traces of a Bronze Age people, older than Homer, older than Athens, who had once ruled the Aegean. Then came the moment that changed everything. On a plot of land known as Kefala Hill, Evans and his workers unearthed a massive structure buried beneath centuries of dust and rubble. Walls emerged, not simple huts, but foundations of rooms, staircases, corridors. What they were looking at wasn't a temple or a fortress, but a palace. And not just any palace, one so complex it seemed designed to confuse anyone who walked inside. A labyrinth, perhaps. Evans immediately made the connection. This had to be the Palace of Knossos, legendary seat of King Minos, the same Minos who, according to myth, imprisoned the half-man, half-bull Minotaur deep within a maze beneath his home. Whether myth or not, the ruins matched the story. Countless twisting halls, multiple floors, mysterious dead ends. It was a palace that defied logic, as if built to trap not just people, but time itself. He called the people who built it the Minoans after Minos. No one knew what they had called themselves. Their script, known as Linear A, was still undeciphered. But their art, their architecture, and their reach suggested an empire long forgotten. And so, with trowel in hand and a myth in mind, Evans began to peel back the centuries. What he found would challenge everything people thought they knew about early European civilization and ignite new debates that still haven't settled. The Palace of Knossos is not a palace in the traditional sense. It's a puzzle made of corridors, courts, and chambers that seems to double back on itself with every turn. Covering more than 150,000 square feet, the structure was a multi-story marvel of the ancient world, and at its heart lay a paradox. How could something so open, so light-filled and advanced feel so impossible to map? There were no grand walls or moats, no militaristic towers instead. Knossos had balconies, skylights, and air shafts, architectural features unheard of in Bronze Age Europe. The entire complex seemed designed not for war, but for ceremony, administration, and perhaps mystery. Stairs wound in dizzying spirals, narrow corridors opened into sudden courtyards, rooms connected unexpectedly. Scholars have debated for over a century whether this design was intentional, a symbolic nod to the myth of the labyrinth, or simply the result of centuries of rebuilding. To walk through Knossos is to surrender any sense of direction. There are rooms within rooms, wings that loop into each other, and passageways that lead nowhere at all. Evans was convinced this layout reflected the story of Daedalus, the legendary craftsman who constructed the labyrinth for King Minos to imprison the Minotaur. While there's no archaeological proof of a literal monster, the confusion felt while navigating the site is very real. And yet the palace wasn't just a maze. It was a miracle of ancient engineering. The complex featured advanced plumbing, including terracotta pipes, flushing toilets, and a drainage system so efficient it would make parts of 19th century Europe blush. Rooms had natural ventilation. Light wells illuminated the inner chambers. Some staircases plunged down 3 or 4 stories, suggesting a deep-tiered structure rarely seen before the modern era. The throne room, modest by royal standards, lies tucked deep inside, almost hidden. Its centerpiece is a stone chair flanked by griffin frescoes surrounded by benches. This wasn't a place of spectacle, but of controlled ritual. Perhaps here power was less about dominance and more about illusion, mysticism, or religious. Knossos wasn't built to intimidate. It was built to mystify. Whether you were a traitor, priestess, or foreign envoy, one truth was certain. Once you entered, the palace swallowed you whole and made you forget the path you came from. Though the stone walls of Knossos are crumbling, its colors still speak. Buried beneath volcanic ash and time, the palace's frescoes emerged as some of the most vivid, enigmatic, and advanced artworks of the ancient world. Unlike the rigid, militaristic art of later Greek or Egyptian civilizations, the Minoan frescoes burst with movement of dancers, dolphins, bulls, and goddesses. They didn't just decorate rooms, they told stories, hinted at rituals, and revealed a civilization that seemed to love life, beauty, and rhythm. One of the most iconic images from Knossos is the bull leaping fresco, a young figure somersaulting over a massive bull in an elegant, impossible art. Was this real? Was it a myth? Historians have debated it for over a century. Was it a ritualistic sport, a religious offering, or simply a metaphor for taming chaos, regardless of its meaning? The image captures something essential about Minoan life, a dance with danger, with grace at its core. Elsewhere, the walls bloom with lilies and crocuses, monkeys and birds, spirals and waves. In the Prince of the Lilies fresco, a slender youth with flowing hair and an ornate crown struts with ceremonial confidence. Though Evans initially identified him as a prince, modern scholars aren't sure the figure may represent a priest, or even a goddess. Gender in Minoan art is fluid, symbolic, and still deeply mysterious. Unlike many ancient civilizations, the Minoans didn't focus their art on kings, wars, or conquests. There are no depictions of battles or slaves. Instead, there are scenes of celebration, of nature, of sacred rites. Women are central, not in the background, but front and center. Bare-breasted priestesses with elaborate skirts and coiled hairstyles perform rituals, suggesting that women may have held significant, even dominant, religious roles in the colors. Deep reds, blues, and whites still cling to the plaster after thousands of years, defying time. The vibrancy of the artwork hints at a society that not only valued aesthetics, but understood their emotional power. These weren't just pretty paintings. They were symbols of cosmic order, human joy, and spiritual reverence. In the Palace of Knossos, the walls didn't just see history, they sang it. In pigment and pattern, the Minoans painted a world of motion, mystery, and meaning. Among the many enigmas of Knossos, one stands out above all the prominence of women, unlike many contemporary societies where women were confined to the margins. The Minoans placed them at the center, literally and symbolically. Their images dominate frescoes, figurines, and ceremonial scenes, hinting at a civilization where female power wasn't hidden. It was celebrated in the central court and sacred chambers of Knossos. Depictions of bare-breasted women in flounced skirts and ornate headdresses appear again and again. These weren't submissive figures tucked behind kings. They were front and center, arms raised in blessing, holding serpents surrounded by symbols of fertility, animals, and divine energy. Scholars believe many of these women were priestesses, intermediaries between the mortal and divine, responsible for overseeing rituals that touched every aspect of Minoan life. One of the most famous artifacts from the palace is the snake goddess figurine, a woman with a piercing gaze holding serpents in both hands, with a feline perched on her head. Was she a deity? A high priestess? A representation of female sovereignty? We may never know, but her image tells us volumes about the spiritual hierarchy of Knossos and who may have stood at its peak. In contrast to the pharaohs of Egypt or the kings of Mycenae, no clear Minoan male ruler has ever been identified in the Ark, no grand statue of a king, no battle scenes glorifying a warlord. It led many scholars to suggest that Minoan society may have been matriarchal, or at least unusually egalitarian for its time. Women likely held power in both religion and possibly governance, guiding seasonal festivals, managing temples, and performing state rituals. Even the architecture reflects this balance. Rooms believed to be used by high-ranking women with direct access to shrines, light wells, and private staircases suggest they moved freely through the palace. Some frescoes depict women gathering in ceremonial processions, dressed in vivid garments, their posture commanding, not deferential. In Knossos, femininity wasn't confined. It was divine. Whether as priestesses, leaders, or symbols of renewal, women weren't secondary to Minoan culture. They were the culture, its voice, its vision, and possibly its soul. Knossos was not just a royal residence. It was a stage for the sacred. Every corridor, courtyard, and chambers seemed to pulse with spiritual intent. From underground crypts to sun-drenched altars, the palace was built not merely for living, but for communing with the divine. And while no Minoan holy book survives, the architecture itself whispers of rituals that shaped their world. The palace featured dozens of small shrines and ritual rooms, many of them tucked into secluded corners or carved deep below the ground. These weren't places for mass worship. They were intimate, mysterious, and likely restricted to the priestess elite. One chamber, often called the lustral basin, features a sunken tub-like structure at the base of a narrow staircase, not meant for bathing, but likely for purification rites. Perhaps initiates descended in silence, cleansed by symbolic waters before entering sacred ceremonies. The central court, vast and open to the sky, was likely the heart of public ritual. Here, hundreds might have gathered for seasonal festivals, celebrating fertility, renewal, or the turning of the year. The rhythmic sound of drums, the twirl of dancers, the chants of priestesses. Knossos was alive with ceremony, and always present in these rites was the bull, that powerful symbol of energy, virility, and the natural world. Throughout the palace, bull horns, stylized and massive, were placed atop walls and entrances. These horns of consecration, as Evans called them, marked sacred thresholds. Paired with the bull leaping imagery found in frescoes, it's clear that this animal held deep religious meaning. Some believe a live bull may have even been part of certain rituals, not in brutal sacrifice, but as a partner in a spiritual performance meant to mirror the eternal dance of chaos and order. The double axe, or labrys, was another symbol often associated with sacred spaces in Knossos. Found carved into pillars and walls, it may have been a tool, a weapon, or a divine emblem. Its frequent pairing with female figures further supports the idea of a goddess-centered religion. No temples in the traditional sense exist at Knossos. Instead, the palace itself was the temple, every stairwell a procession, every chamber a chapel. It was a place where the spiritual and political were one, and where sacredness was woven into the very walls amid the frescoes, altars, and labyrinthine chambers of Knossos. Archaeologists uncovered something even more puzzling: writing. Hundreds of clay tablets inscribed with symbols that no one to this day can fully understand. This was Lineara, the script of the Minoans, and one of the last great undeciphered writing systems of the ancient world. Discovered during Evans's excavations, Lineara looked superficially similar to another script found in Mycenaean Greece, known as Linear B. Evans assumed they were related, and they were. But while Linear B was later cracked and revealed to be an early form of Greek, Lineara stubbornly refused to give up its secrets. It's a language unrelated to Greek, and possibly unrelated to any known language on Earth. We can read its characters phonetically, but we don't know what they mean. Most Linear tablets found at Knossos are administrative inventories of grain, oil, livestock, or offerings. But without knowing the language, the context remains elusive. Were these taxes ritual offerings? Market records? No one can say with certainty. The Minoans wrote for over 500 years, and yet we still can't understand a single full sentence. This linguistic blackout gives Knossos its dreamlike quality. It's like listening to music through a wall. You can sense the rhythm, the energy, the intent, but the lyrics are forever muffled. We can see their rituals in art, their architecture in stone, but their thoughts remain sealed. Linear A was written with a stylus on soft clay, then baked by accident, preserved only because the palace was destroyed by fire. Without that disaster, their words might have dissolved long ago. Ironically, the burning of Knossos gifted us with the only surviving fragments of Minoan language. Some scholars believe Linear A might one day be deciphered, especially if bilingual texts are found, much like how the Rosetta Stone cracked Egyptian hieroglyphs. Until then, we're left with isolated symbols. A man, a bull, a jar's son. Meaningless and yet hauntingly familiar. Knossos, for all its color and complexity, speaks to us in silence. Its language sits just beyond reach, reminding us that some of history's greatest voices still wait to be heard, buried not in earth, but in mystery. The Palace of Knossos, once a beacon of art, architecture, and ritual, did not vanish in a single cataclysm. Its fall was not swift, but layered, a slow unraveling of a civilization whose power once seemed eternal. And like so many ancient collapses, the truth behind Knossos' downfall is a tapestry of fire, water, and whispers of war. Around 1450 BCE, something changed. Suddenly across Crete, Minoan palaces and towns began to burn. Knossos, curiously, did not fall immediately. Instead, it was reoccupied. But the frescoes changed. The writing on the clay tablets shifted from Linear A to Linear B, not Minoan, but Mycenaean Greek. This suggests that the Mycenaeans, the rising power from the mainland, had either invaded or taken control peacefully after a catastrophe weakened the Minoans. Whatever the method, Knossos was no longer ruled by its native people. One theory points to the eruption of Thera, a volcanic explosion on the island of Santorini, just north of Crete, around 1600 BCE. This cataclysm was one of the most powerful in recorded history, devastating the region with earthquakes and tsunamis. The resulting chaos may have crippled the Minoan economy, wrecked their ports, and weakened their influence, leaving them vulnerable to invasion or internal collapse. Others argue for a gradual economic and political decline. As trade routes shifted and rivals grew stronger, the centralized power of Knossos may have fractured. The palace, once buzzing with activity, became more administrative. More subdued rituals gave way to record-keeping. Art gave way to imitation. By 1375 BCE, the palace was abandoned entirely. Fires raged through its halls, roofs collapsed, walls cracked and buckled. Knossos was left in silence, its colors fading, its language unread, its rituals forgotten. And yet it was never truly lost. Legends of the Labyrinth and the Minotaur survived in Greek myth. Hints of Minoan influence echoed through Mycenaean palaces and later in classical art and architecture. The soul of Knossos lingered like smoke, invisible but present. Today, its ruins are open to the sun again. Tourists walk where priestesses once danced, and the palace that once held a civilization together now holds its secrets in plain sight. Majestic, mysterious, and unfinished. When Sir Arthur Evans uncovered Knossos in 1900, he didn't just excavate it, he reimagined it. With a mix of scholarly ambition and artistic vision, Evans set out not only to preserve the ruins, but to bring them to life. He believed that simply exposing the foundations wasn't enough. The world needed to see the palace as he believed it once was, colorful, complex, and awe-inspiring. What followed was one of the most controversial restorations in archaeological history. Using concrete, a material completely alien to the Bronze Age, Evans rebuilt sections of the palace with modern methods. He employed artists to repaint frescoes using fragments found on site, but often filled in missing details based on assumption, not evidence. Balconies were reconstructed. Columns were restored not in dull stone, but painted red with black caps based on Evans's vision of Minoan aesthetics. Rooms were roofed, walls were replastered, and the ancient palace slowly became a hybrid, part ruin, part Edwardian fantasy. Some applauded his boldness. Without Evans, they argued, Knossos might have remained just another tangle of unremarkable ruins. His reconstructions made the site accessible, educational, and emotionally compelling. Visitors could walk through halls that felt alive, see murals bursting with color, and visualize the world of the Minoans with more clarity than ever before. but others saw it differently. Critics accused Evans of overstepping, of imposing his own interpretation on a civilization we still barely understand. The frescoes, for instance, were sometimes almost entirely invented based on small shards of original paint. Whole sections of the palace, such as the famous throne room, may have been assigned functions they never had. By shaping the ruins to match myth, Evans may have blurred the line between archaeology and storytelling. Today, Knossos is both a marvel and a monument to the complexities of historical reconstruction. Evans' vision cannot be separated from the site. His concrete structures still stand. His artistic interpretations still color the walls. But visitors walk through Knossos with a dual awareness of what the Minoans might have built and what a passionate archaeologist believed they did. In trying to bring Knossos back to life, Evans may have given us two palaces, one ancient, buried in the earth, and one imagined, standing boldly above it. Today, the Palace of Knossos stands not only as a ruin, but as a bridge between myth and history, imagination and evidence, Europe and the ancient world. Long after its last ritual was performed and its halls fell silent, Knossos continued to fascinate, mystify, and provoke. Its very existence challenges our assumptions about early civilization and forces us to confront how little we still know. The palace helped redefine the timeline of European history. Before its discovery, most scholars believed that advanced civilization began with the Greeks. Knossos rewrote that narrative. Here is a culture flourishing 1,000 years earlier with plumbing, urban planning, international trade, and symbolic art. The Minoans, centered in Knossos, were not primitive. They were sophisticated, expressive, and deeply spiritual. But Knossos' legacy is inseparable from its mythology. For millennia, the story of the Minotaur in the labyrinth was dismissed as fiction, a fable to frighten or entertain. And yet, when archaeologists unearthed a palace with hundreds of rooms, corridors that looped and twisted, and symbols of bulls carved into stone, the line between myth and history blurred. Perhaps the legend was not invented, but remembered, filtered through generations until only fragments survived. In modern times, Knossos has inspired not just scholars, but writers, artists, and architects. Its double axes, horn symbols, and sinuous frescoes have appeared in fashion, sculpture, and even science fiction. The idea of a hidden ancient civilization beneath the Mediterranean still fuels imaginations. A vision of a time when power didn't mean pyramids or conquest, but beauty, ritual, and balance. Yet Knossos also reminds us of fragility. The palace fell. Its language was lost, its people vanished, and its meaning, its real, original purpose, is still debated. Every interpretation is a mirror reflecting not just the past, but what we want to believe about it. Walk its halls today, and you stand where priestesses once prayed, dancers once twirled, and children once laughed. You stand at the heart of the oldest palace in Europe, a place that lived between sunlight and shadow, between architecture and myth. Knossos may never give up all its secrets, but in its silence, it still speaks of mystery, memory, and the deep labyrinthine path of civilization itself. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus was born on December 15, 37 CA, child of privilege, but also of poison. His lineage was imperial. Tangled in the Julio-Claudian dynasty that ruled Rome with both splendor and suspicion, his mother, Agrippina the Younger, was the sister of Emperor Caligula, great-granddaughter of Augustus, and one of the most cunning political players of her time. His father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was known for arrogance and cruelty. It was said that when someone congratulated him on the birth of his son, he muttered, "Nothing could be born from me and Agrippina, but something monstrous." Whether that was a prophecy or just bitterness, time would tell. At just 2 years old, Nero lost his father to dropsy, or possibly to poison. In a Rome where alliances were fatal and ambition was a blood sport, Agrippina now found herself a widow with a child and no real power. But she was patient. She watched as her brother Caligula spiraled into tyranny and was murdered by his own guards. She kept quiet as Claudius, the stammering, bookish uncle, was lifted to the purple robe. Then she made her move. By 49 CE, Agrippina seduced Emperor Claudius, her own uncle, and married him. She wasn't subtle about her goals. Within a year, she convinced him to adopt her son as heir, passing over his own biological son, Britannicus. Lucius became Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus, a name fit for emperors. She arranged his engagement to Claudius's daughter, Octavia, and hired Rome's finest tutors to mold him. Chief among them was the Stoic philosopher Seneca, who tried to shape the young man into a noble ruler. From the outside, Nero was being groomed for greatness, educated in rhetoric, poetry, philosophy, and music. He learned how to command a crowd, recite Homer, and manipulate public opinion. But Agrippina still held the reins. She appeared beside him in ceremonies, ordered his household, and made it clear who truly wielded power. Nero's rise wasn't born from destiny. It was engineered by a mother who saw herself as empress long before her son ever wore a crown. And within that gilded nursery of ambition and manipulation, the seeds of a chaotic reign were quietly planted. In 54 CE, at just 16 years old, Nero became emperor of Rome. Claudius, his adoptive father, had died officially of illness, though many suspected poison. And the prime suspect? Agrippina. She had long grown impatient with waiting, and when Claudius began reconsidering his biological son Britannicus's heir, she acted. Mushrooms, legend said, were the delivery method, the food of the gods, some joked darkly, and perhaps the food of murder. With Claudius dead, Nero was rushed into power. The Roman Senate approved, the Praetorian Guard applauded, and Agrippina stood triumphantly behind him, dressed in gold and flanked by guards, the real architect of the regime. But she hadn't raised an emperor. She had built a puppet. In the early months of Nero's reign, Rome prospered. He gave generous bonuses to the soldiers, held public games, and promised a return to Augustan values. Behind the scenes, governance was handled by two key figures: Seneca, a philosopher tutor turned speechwriter, and Burrus, the pragmatic head of the Praetorian Guard. Together, they steered Nero through complex decisions while maintaining a veneer of noble restraint. But Agrippina wasn't content to stay in the wings. She expected to rule beside her son, and when Nero began asserting his independence, tensions exploded. At first, the battles were subtle. She demanded to appear on coins beside Nero's image, something no Roman mother had ever done. She intruded on state meetings. She walked into the Senate chamber uninvited. She reminded Nero constantly who had made him emperor. The young emperor chafed under her control. He began to surround himself with his own advisors, men of pleasure and art, not of duty. He fell in love with Acte, a former slave girl, much to Agrippina's horror. She had plans for a royal marriage, not romance with a commoner. The once close bond between mother and son began to sour. Whispers spread through the palace of shouting matches, slammed doors, veiled threats. Agrippina, once revered as the empress maker, now seemed a looming threat. Rome had given Nero a throne, but Agrippina still held a leash, and Nero was beginning to reach for the knife. His reign had begun with promise, poetry, and applause, but behind the curtain, a family tragedy was already brewing, one that would stain the imperial purple with blood. By 59 CE, the imperial palace had turned into a battlefield, not of armies, but of wills. Nero was emperor in name, but his mother, Agrippina, still loomed like a storm cloud over every decision. She undermined his authority, opposed his personal life, and plotted in the shadows to replace him with Britannicus, the late Claudius's biological son. Nero, once the obedient boy with a lyre, had become a young man desperate to escape her grasp. He acted first. Britannicus, a legitimate threat to Nero's throne, suddenly died during a banquet. Guests claimed he choked on his wine, but the poison was so fast-acting his death was unmistakable. Nero denied involvement. Few believed him. Agrippina certainly didn't. With Britannicus gone, Nero's next problem was his mother. She had once ruled through him. Now he saw her as a rival. Agrippina wasn't just politically ambitious. She was relentless. She met with senators in secret. She paraded noblemen she hoped to position as replacements. She made veiled threats about the Praetorian Guard's loyalties. And worst of all for Nero, people still loved her. Rome admired strong women when they weren't too strong. Agrippina had crossed that line. Nero first tried exile. He stripped her of her bodyguards, removed her from public appearances, and sent her to live in a coastal villa. But distance didn't silence her. She still corresponded, still whispered, still pulled strings. So Nero made a darker choice. He invited Agrippina to a grand celebration, gifting her a lavish boat for her return voyage, but the vessel had been rigged to collapse mid-sea. When the sabotaged ship broke apart, Agrippina survived, swimming to shore under moonlight. The botched attempt enraged and humiliated Nero, so he tried again. This time he sent assassins to her villa under the pretense of an urgent message. Accounts vary, but one story says she faced her killers calmly, telling them to strike her in the womb, the place that had given birth to Nero. Her murder sent shock waves through the empire. Nero's guilt was immediate and consuming. He couldn't sleep. He paced at night. He saw her ghost in the halls. Rome, too, whispered of the unthinkable crime, the emperor who had killed his mother. With Agrippina's death, Nero had finally broken free, but in doing so, he also severed the last tether to restraint. What followed would be a reign untethered by shame and spiraling toward infamy. With Agrippina gone, Nero was finally emperor in full. No more whispers, no more maternal oversight, just unfiltered power. But instead of channeling that power into military conquest or administrative reform, Nero turned inward. He didn't want to be remembered as a ruler. He wanted to be adored as an artist. He fancied himself a poet, a singer, an actor. He performed publicly, something no Roman emperor had dared to do. To the Senate and aristocracy, it was mortifying. In Roman tradition, the stage was reserved for slaves and foreigners, but Nero was undeterred. He trained in music and drama, demanded applause, and filled amphitheaters with forcibly enthusiastic audiences. The emperor didn't just host games. He starred in them. Nero composed verses, sang tragic arias, and recited long epics of his own creation. He prided himself on his voice, even undergoing strange treatments to preserve it, including vomiting rituals, long periods of silence, and bizarre diets. Senators sat through hours-long performances, terrified to leave their seats. Not clapping could mean exile or worse. He also threw resources into building theaters, sponsoring athletic contests, and redesigning Rome to reflect his aesthetic tastes. He introduced Greek-style games like the Neuronia, a blend of Olympic sports and theatrical competitions where, unsurprisingly, Nero always won first prize. His obsession with performance spilled into foreign policy. On a trip to Greece, Nero insisted on competing in every artistic contest. At the Olympic Games, he took part in a chariot race with 10 horses instead of the standard 4. He fell off his chariot mid-race, but was still declared the victor. Why? Because he would have won had he not fallen. A triumph in Nero's eyes. Yet even as he indulged in these creative fantasies, the empire groaned. Administrators were neglected. Governors acted without oversight. The provinces grew restless. But Nero didn't care. He wasn't trying to be another Augustus or Tiberius. He wanted to be Orpheus, Apollo, or maybe something even greater, a god of music with absolute power. To the Roman elite, he was becoming a national embarrassment. But to the masses, given bread, games, and endless entertainment, Nero was a living spectacle, a flawed god on stage, singing over the cracks in his collapsing empire. In July of 64 CE, a fire ignited near the Circus Maximus. Within hours, flames surged through the city like a divine curse. The streets of Rome, narrow, overcrowded, flammable, became a furnace. For 6 days and 7 nights, the capital of the empire burned. By the end, 10 of the city's 14 districts were reduced to rubble. Thousands were homeless. Temples, homes, marketplaces gone. And where was the emperor? Rumors flew. Some claimed Nero had watched the blaze from a tower, strumming his lyre and singing of Troy's destruction. Others swore he had ordered the fire himself to make room for a new palace. Nero denied both, and in truth, he wasn't even in Rome when the fire began. But when he returned, he acted with theatrical flair, opening his private gardens to refugees, organizing emergency food deliveries and funding reconstruction. Yet the whispers persisted. People needed a scapegoat, and Nero, ever the dramatist, gave them one. He blamed the Christians. They were already mistrusted, a strange sect of Jews who worshipped the crucified man and refused to honor the Roman gods. Nero accused them of arson and began a persecution so brutal it would echo through the centuries. Christians were torn apart by dogs, crucified, and, most horrifyingly, burned alive to serve as torches for Nero's garden parties. It wasn't justice, it was theater by firelight. Meanwhile, Nero unveiled his true ambition, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. In the ashes of central Rome, he began constructing a pleasure palace of unimaginable extravagance, with artificial lakes, gilded walls, and revolving dining rooms, and ceilings that sprinkled perfume. It was a monument to indulgence. A colossal statue of himself, the Colossus of Nero, was planned to tower over it all. To many Romans, this confirmed their suspicions. Nero hadn't just let the city burn. He had used the fire as a blank canvas. He had erased old Rome to paint a new one, starring himself. But Nero saw it differently in his mind. He wasn't destroying, he was creating. He was remaking Rome in his image. Dramatic, divine, and unforgettable. In trying to immortalize himself through art and architecture, Nero scorched the earth and lit the fuse of his own downfall. As Nero's reign dragged on, the applause began to fade and the fear took its place. The emperor who once danced across the stage now paced palace corridors in a state of growing paranoia. He saw enemies in every shadow, conspiracies in every whisper. The artist emperor had become a tyrant in a mask of grease paint. Following the fire and the unpopular construction of his Golden House, Nero's standing with the Senate deteriorated rapidly. The aristocracy, already offended by his performances and extravagance, now feared for their lives in 65 CE. A plot was uncovered, the Pisonian conspiracy, in which dozens of senators, equestrians, and even soldiers were implicated in a scheme to overthrow him. Some wanted to restore the Republic. Others simply wanted anyone but Nero. Nero's response was swift and ruthless. The poet Lucan, the philosopher Seneca, and the general Fenius Rufus were all ordered to commit suicide. Seneca, Nero's former tutor, and once his moral compass, was forced to slit his wrists while calmly discussing Stoic philosophy. Even those only rumored to be sympathetic to the plot were swept up in the purges. The palace became a house of executions, the Senate chamber a silent theater of obedience. The emperor's paranoia deepened. He accused his own wife Octavia of infidelity, a charge so flimsy it insulted the intelligence of even his closest allies. She was exiled, then executed. Her head was sent to his mistress, Poppaea Sabina, as a twisted token of affection. But even Poppaea wasn't safe. During a rage, or possibly a drunken argument, Nero kicked her in the stomach while she was pregnant. She died soon after. Some say he wept for days. Others claim he mourned the loss of his muse, not the woman. Poison became a regular tool in his arsenal. He relied on the infamous poisoner Locusta, a woman whose concoctions had killed emperors and rivals alike. At Nero's command, she trained others, creating a small macabre academy of assassination. By now, Nero's court resembled a stage soaked in blood. Every friend was a suspect, every ally a potential betrayer, and through it all, Nero continued to sing, perform, and believe that he was loved. But the audience was shrinking, the laughter was nervous, and the knives were getting closer. While Nero indulged in performances and purges in Rome, the empire beyond the capital began to rumble. The provinces, long the backbone of Rome's power, grew restless under the weight of neglect, extortion, and Nero's increasingly erratic rule. Taxes were high. Governors were corrupt, and military prestige had eroded in distant corners of the empire. Patience wore thin, and rebellion stirred. The first crack came from the east. In 66 CE, the province of Judea erupted into full revolt. Tensions between Roman authorities and the Jewish population had simmered for years, fueled by religious oppression and heavy taxation. When Nero's appointed governors desecrated sacred temples and looted treasuries, open war broke out. The First Jewish-Roman War began, and it would cost Rome dearly. Nero dispatched one of his most competent generals, Vespasian, to crush the rebellion. Ironically, this act would later prove fatal to Nero's own reign. Meanwhile, in the west, the storm clouds gathered darker still. In Gaul and Spain, Roman legions began murmuring discontent. Nero's lavish lifestyle, the destruction of Rome, and his cruelty had eroded the loyalty of both aristocrats and soldiers. Governors like Gaius Julius Vindex in Gaul declared open rebellion in 68 CE, accusing Nero of being a disgrace to Rome, a self-absorbed performer unworthy of the purple. Vindex's rebellion failed militarily, but succeeded politically. It emboldened others. Servius Sulpicius Galba, powerful governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, refused to recognize Nero's authority and declared himself a legate of the Senate and people of Rome. It was the first open call for regime change. Back in Rome, panic took hold. Nero's supporters began to flee or turn against him. The Senate, sensing the shift in power, grew bolder. The Praetorian Guard, once his fiercest protectors, was now bribed by Galba's agents. Their loyalty, like everything else in Nero's court, was transactional. Nero tried to rally support. He wept, begged, even considered fleeing to the eastern provinces and returning as a popular artist. But it was too late. The empire had turned against its self-declared god performer. Nero's isolation was complete. The provinces that had once cheered his rise now lit the fuse of his destruction. The emperor had lost his stage, and now the curtain was falling. By June of 68 CE, Nero was emperor in name only. The Senate had turned. The Praetorian Guard, once the iron wall around his throne, had declared allegiance to Galba. The people of Rome, once entertained by his games and theatrics, now watched in silence as the city held its breath. The empire that Nero had once tried to turn into a stage had now left him without an audience when Nero awoke on June 9th. Messengers brought news that sealed his fate. The Senate had declared him a public enemy. He was to be arrested and executed by the traditional Roman method, point a coolie, or being beaten to death while naked, his head clamped in a forked stick. The same man who once performed to adoring crowds would now die humiliated and alone. Panicked, Nero fled Rome in disguise, dressed in rags and accompanied by a few loyal freedmen. They took refuge in the villa of his former secretary, located in the countryside outside the city. There, in a dark, overgrown garden, the last Julio Claudian emperor hid in a ditch, listening for the sound of approaching horsemen. Even in his final hours, Nero's obsession with legacy did not fade. When he heard hoofbeats in the distance, he reportedly cried out, "When an artist dies in me." It was not Rome he mourned, but himself, his talent, his image, his tragic ending. His companions urged him to die by his own hand, but he hesitated for all his brutality. Nero was a coward when it came to death. Finally, his soldiers drew near. He pressed a dagger to his throat with the help of a freedman named Epaphroditus. The blade pierced flesh. He did not die immediately. As blood filled his lungs, he whispered too late, "This is fidelity." He was 30 years old. The soldiers found his dying body astonished. The Senate, now under Galba, ordered his burial in a simple grave. No state funeral, no divine honors, just a quiet end to a chaotic reign with Nero's death, the Julio Claudian dynasty. The line of Augustus, Tiberius, and Claudius was extinguished. What followed was a new storm, civil war, chaos, and the rapid rise and fall of emperors. But one thing was clear. Rome would never forget Nero. Nero's body was barely cold before legends began to bloom. Some Romans rejoiced, others mourned, and still more whispered that he wasn't really dead, that he had escaped to the east, and would one day return. Over the next few decades, no fewer than 3 impostors claimed to be the resurrected Nero, appearing in Asia Minor with lyres in hand and songs on their lips. The myth of Nero, it seemed, had only just begun. For many in the Roman elite, his legacy was clear. Nero was a monster, a megalomaniac who murdered his own mother, burned his capital, and disgraced the empire with his narcissistic performances. The historians who chronicled his life, Tacitus Suetonius Cassius Dio, painted him as a cautionary tale, the artist emperor who let vanity devour virtue. And yet not everyone agreed. Among the lower classes, Nero remained oddly beloved. He had reduced taxes, built public baths, and organized massive games and grain distributions. He gave Rome its greatest spectacles. Some even considered him a populist. Vulgar, yes, but generous. Centuries later, Christian texts would demonize him further, with early writers labeling Nero the first Antichrist and possibly the beast of Revelation. He was remembered not just as a bad ruler, but as a cosmic villain. Still, there was something magnetic about Nero's story. He was not the calculating tyrant that Tiberius or Caligula had been. He was theatrical. Flamboyant, impulsive, often absurd. He ruled like a man in a permanent dream, casting himself as poet, god, and tragic hero all at once. Even his death felt like a scene from a lost Greek tragedy. In later centuries, artists, playwrights, and filmmakers would resurrect Nero as a symbol of fallen grandeur, a ruler too obsessed with beauty to bear the ugliness of power. His name became shorthand for excess and decline, a lesson in what happens when ego eclipses empire. But perhaps Nero's strangest legacy is this: he made power performative. He understood centuries before mass media that image could be as strong as policy, that if you control the narrative, you could shape the future's memory. And in that sense, he got what he wanted. 2,000 years later, we still remember Nero, not for ruling Rome, but for burning his name into history's stage.